I'll water it down, Hiccup replied, pouring a small amount of ale into his horn. He filled the rest of it with water and handed it over to his daughter. Zephyr sniffed the substance hesitantly, unsure if she actually wanted to drink it. After a few seconds, she decided to give it a try and brought the horn to her lips. As soon as the alcohol entered her mouth, she spat it out, splashing the wooden slab in front of her. Irette laughed while Hiccup stifled a chuckle. "It's disgusting!" Zephyr exclaimed, outraged. "I don't understand how you can drink it. This is that kind of taste that you have to grow up to," Hiccup explained when he stopped laughing at his daughter's reaction. "It's terrible," Zephyr proclaimed, handing the horn back to her father. Hiccup accepted it and brought it to his lips. He spat the alcohol immediately as well. "Oh shit," he commented, looking at the horn with wide eyes. "Ale never tasted so terribly." "It's horrible," Hiccup added, pouring the content of his horn out on the floor next to his chair. Then, he refilled it and drank the ale eagerly, attempting to wash off the unpleasant aftertaste from his tongue. "Never try to water it down," he warned Irette. His second-in-command laughed at his words, drinking from his horn as well. "I think it's time," the dark-haired man announced after a few minutes, looking at his chief. Hiccup nodded his head in understanding while Irette turned around to whisper something to Camille. The young chief bent forward, searching for something under the table. After a few seconds, he straightened himself back, holding a lute in his hand. "Are you sure you want me to do that?" Hiccup asked his friend as he checked if the instrument was well tuned. He smiled slightly when he stated that it was ready to be played. "Of course," Irette replied immediately. "You're the only one who knows how to use that," he said, gesturing at the instrument that Hiccup was holding in his hands. "And this song sounds good only when accompanied by a lute." Hiccup sighed heavily, running his fingers through the strings to find out how the lute sounded. "Go on then," he told his second-in-command. "I'm ready." Following Hiccup's advice, Irette hit the table with his horn a few times. Surprisingly, his action had the desired effect, and the whole great hall went silent almost immediately. The newlywed couple stood up from their chairs simultaneously, holding their hands. They walked around the table, heading towards the center of the great hall. As soon as they were ready, Hiccup began playing on the lute, starting with the soft chords. The sound filled the great hall instantly, even though the young chief had only one instrument. The attendants grinned widely and began whispering something to each other when they recognized the well-known melody. Irette started whistling softly, making sure that the sound matched that of Hiccup's lute. "I'll swim and sail on savage seas," he started singing, slowly approaching Camille. His wife wasn't facing him. "With never fear of drowning. And gladly ride the waves of life if you will marry me," he sang softly, decreasing the distance that separated him and his wife. "No scorching sun, nor freezing cold will stop me on my journey if you will promise me your heart." He trailed off, encircling Camille with his arms. "And love me for eternity," she sang back, slowly turning around to face her husband. "My dearest one, my darling dear, your mighty words astound me," Camille recited the song, taking a few steps backward. "But I've no need for mighty deeds when I feel your arms around me," she sang, raising her hand in front of her. Irette smiled and raised his own arm, joining their forearms. They slowly started walking in circles, changing hands from time to time. "But I would bring you rings of gold and even sign you poetry," Irette sang back, grasping Camille's hand. Simultaneously, they started jumping from one foot to the next. After a few seconds, he kneeled in front of her, raising his arm above his head and allowing his wife to encircle him. "And I would keep you from all harm," he sang, standing up and placing his hand on Camille's back. He pulled her towards him. "If you would stay beside me." "I have no use for rings of gold," Camille sang back, turning around to face Irette with her back. Their hands were entwined. "I care not for your poetry. I only want your hand to hold." She trailed off as they swung to the melody that Hiccup was playing on his lute. "I only want you near me," Irette replied, twirling his wife in his arms. Camille's hair was cutting the air with her each rotation. It was a miracle that her husband has somehow managed to avoid being hit by her braids. To love, to kiss, to sweetly hold, they started singing together, keeping their hands on each other's back and rotating in one direction. Some of the people gathered at the feast joined the newlywed couple and started dancing and singing as well. For the dancing and the dreaming. Through all life's sorrows and delights, I'll keep your love beside me. I'll swim and sail on savage seas with never fear of drowning. And gladly ride the waves of life if you will marry me. Irette and Camille exclaimed happily. Hiccup's second in command lifted his wife and twirled them around a couple of times. This song lasted for a few more minutes, as no one was willing to end it so soon. And so, they repeated the chorus eagerly and danced around the newlywed couple. Hiccup, while still playing on the lute, was singing as well, grinning from ear to ear at his friend's happiness. Even though it had only just begun, he had to admit that it was the best snoggletog in his life. Hiccup put aside the lute as some of his villagers started playing on their instruments, realizing that it was their time to take over and make sure that the wedding would be enjoyable. The young chief sipped from his horn as he watched the newlyweds returning to the main table. He took out his pipe and filled it with the dried leaves. Hiccup turned around in his chair to face Toothless. The black dragon quickly understood what its rider wanted and let out a small stream of fire, igniting the content of his pipe. Hiccup inhaled deeply and let out a large cloud of smoke. "How did we do?" Camille demanded to know when they returned to the main table and sat down on their respective chairs. They both were panting heavily, and thin layers of sweat were already covering their foreheads, caused by the heat of the great hall and the physical effort. Incredibly, Heather replied, smiling genuinely at the couple with the horn in her hand. "Not too bad," Hiccup stated, grinning teasingly at them. A few gnawed bones were sent at him as payment for his outrageous comment. Hiccup laughed as he tried to avoid the projectiles, though to no avail. After a few moments, the group of 4 friends was eating, drinking, and talking about everything. Scal was heard from their table every few seconds. Underscore 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 underscore. To say that this was the worst snoggletog in his life was an understatement. Stoic was sitting at the table that was aside and as far away from the others as possible. His only companion was the mug he had received at the beginning of the feast. He was emptying and refilling it on regular basis, attempting to drown his sorrows. His thoughts traveled at the supersonic speed between Burke, his home, and their current situation, Ruderi, to be precise, and to the various ways he wanted to make him suffer. He just couldn't believe the audacity of that man. Stoic felt as if the young chief's every word that was directed at him, or other Burkians, was the greatest humiliation he had ever faced in his entire life. The young man's tone was enough to set his teeth on edge. Even if his words were friendly, his voice was dripping with mockery. And each day he spent on Driki was humiliating him even further. Bertha's appearance on that cursed island was a huge surprise, one that Stoic wished never had happened. The Bog Burglars and the Burkians had a long-lasting friendship and alliance, and to say that he didn't expect them to be allied with a tribe of dragon riders was an understatement. Furthermore, it could even be considered a betrayal of their own league. Stoic was well aware of the burglars' troubles with dragons. After all, almost every tribe in the archipelago faced problems like that, and yet, they had no problems whatsoever with feasting and celebrating with the greatest traitors Stoic had ever met. He shifted his gaze from the content of his mug to the face of his friend. Bertha was engaged in a conversation with someone in the corner of the great hall, and she wasn't paying him any attention. Whatever hatred Stoic felt was quickly swept away and replaced with misery when he glanced at the newlywed couple. Each time he looked at them, their song returned to him in his mind with full strength, reminding him about the times of his youth and Valka. Stoic sighed heavily, hiding his face behind his hands. Oh, how he missed her. He prayed every day to every god he knew that they returned her to him, but his requests have been left unfulfilled. It was in times like that, when he didn't know what he was supposed to do, that he wished for his wife to be there with him again. She always knew how to counsel or console him when he needed that. But she was dead. His Na'u rune, which was burned on his left hand, was reminding him about it each time he looked at it. The other Burkians were scattered around the great hall, attempting to make the most out of the miserable situation they found themselves in. Stoic scanned the entire area, taken by surprise when he noticed that Gobba was talking with Ruderi. Even though he couldn't hear their conversation, Stoic was sure that it was a friendly talk if Gobba's laughter, which he saw rather than heard, was any indication. It was quickly followed by the two men clashing together their cups, spilling ale around them. Stoic's previous anger returned to him with full strength, focused entirely on that single person Riddery. He felt betrayed. First, Bertha turns out to be his friend and ally, and next, Gobber, his closest friend and his most loyal supporter, gets close to the young chief, though not in a way Stoic would wish. That spawn of Loki was turning his own men against him. But the worst part was that the Haddock Patriarch knew that Riddery wasn't doing anything wrong, he was only being a good chief. It shamed Stoic to admit it, but the young man was incredible at that, and he was saying it after almost 3 decades of being a chief himself. He sighed heavily, once again emptying the content of his mug. He missed Hiccup. The past 10 years have been filled with nothing but sorrow for Stoic. The awareness of being the last Haddock that would rule Berk was almost unbearable for him. He had no doubts that his son would have been a great chief, though that realization came too late. It happened only after he started preparing Snotlout to take over him one day. To say that he was disappointed with his nephew was an understatement. The Jorgensen boy simply didn't have the traits of a chief the ones Stoic was sure that Hiccup used to have. And he had no doubts that his son would be able to match Riddery's attitude and even put him to shame. But, just like his wife, Hiccup was dead. And with his son, the rest of Stoic's happiness abandoned him forever. His rumination was interrupted when someone hit his back hard. Stoic coughed violently, choking on the ale that he was drinking. He looked up, only to see Bertha smiling down on him. He averted his gaze away from her, not wanting to face any more humiliation than he already had. "What do you want?" he muttered into his mug. "I did tell you we would talk," Bertha replied, sitting down beside, at an empty bench. "Care to explain how exactly did you get here?" she asked after realizing that Stoic wasn't going to start the conversation. "You don't know it yet," he countered with a question of his own. "I do, but I want to hear your version as well." "We came here looking for help," Stoic said after a moment of silence. "And he imprisoned us." "That's not what I've heard," Bertha replied, taking a sip of ale from her horn. "I've been told that you have attacked them." "Bullshit," Stoic countered immediately. "It was self-defense. We have been attacked by one of Riddery's riders." "I'm sorry, Stoic, but I don't believe you," Bertha said calmly, earning herself a shocked look from her friend. "I know Riddery," she explained, scanning the crowd to find the young chef. She found him sitting at one of the tables, talking with his villagers. "He's not a violent man, and I'm sure that his men didn't want to get themselves into yet another war so quickly after defeating Dager and his berserkers." "Not a violent man," Stoic mocked her with a humorless chuckle. "I saw him executing Dager, Bertha," he said, taking a sip from his mug. "I watched as he cut open his back, chopped his ribs away from his spine, and pulled his lungs out of those wounds," he trotted out, looking her straight in the eyes. Bertha paled slightly at the description, imagining what it looked like. "And he did that only after over a year of being at war with him," she defended the young chief. "I doubt we would do anything different to ensure the safety of our families and villages. He only did what was necessary for his people." "How can you defend him?" Stoic snapped at her. "He's a traitor, he befriended the dragons," he exclaimed accusingly. "And yet, you ally yourself with him." "Well, to be honest, it wasn't entirely my decision, but my daughter's," Bertha replied, ignoring Stoic's hateful tone. "And while I find the idea of living with the dragons disgusting, I cannot ignore the fact that I owe Riddery a favor. He helped us with our own problem, back on Bog," she explained. "And yet he's not willing to do the same for us," Stoic commented. "That's because we've actually asked him for help," Bertha replied, shaking her head in disbelief. "No matter whose version of what happened is correct, I bet that if you talked to him and apologized for what you did, he would change his decision. He's not a heartless monster, you know." "I have nothing to apologize for," he countered immediately. Bertha sighed heavily, leaning away from Stoic and taking a sip of ale from her horn. She smiled slightly when she noticed that Gobber was approaching them. She cleared her throat and stood up from the bench, excusing herself. Bertha exchanged warm smiles with the old blacksmith as they passed each other, allowing him to sit next to his chief. "Shouldn't you be with your new friend?" Stoic asked him venomously when he noticed that Gobber joined him at the table. "You seemed to be getting along with that bastard," he explained. The old blacksmith sighed heavily, rubbing his mustache. I understand your discontent, Stoic Gobber replied, taking a sip from his mug. When he noticed that it was already empty, he picked up the pitcher from the table and refilled his cup, doing the same for his chief. But he's a good lad, he said, looking at his friend. I've ordered you to get rid of him, not to befriend him, Stoic scolded him. Gobber sighed heavily again. With that night fury not leaving his side for a split second, he countered with a question. It would blast me away before I would be able to get close enough to him. You were pretty close to him right now, Stoic reminded him, scanning the crowd to search for the rest of his people. They were scattered around the Great Hall, talking with the inhabitants of Dreeki or the Bog Burglars. And it didn't look like that demon was going to do anything to you. I can't do that, Stoic Gobber muttered hesitantly. I won't kill him, he clarified. What did you say? The chief of Berk asked in disbelief. It was the first time in his life that Gobber has refused to fulfill his command. I gave you an order, he barked at him. And I disobey it, the old blacksmith replied. The alcohol increased his courage rapidly. I won't do that because it's wrong. I hated him at first, I admit it, but when I started working with him in the forge, I've actually got to know him. Riddery is a good man, a great chief, and an incredible father, he complimented the chief of Dreeki. And he reminds me of Hiccup, he added hesitantly, unsure if he wanted to say those words. Stoic's face paled visibly before he gripped Gobber's throat tightly. The old blacksmith struggled against his chief's hold, attempting to liberate himself. Don't compare my son to that bastard ever again, Stoic warned him. Hiccup was 100 times better Viking than that man. They're nothing alike. You would be surprised, Gobber coughed out when he finally managed to release himself from Stoic's tight grip. He stood up from the bench, massaging his throat. If you're not going to do that, then I will do it myself, the chief of Berk announced, returning his direction to his mug. If you harm Riddery in any way, I can promise you that you will regret it, Gobber replied, shaking his head in disbelief. He could hardly recognize Stoic at that moment. It was then that the old blacksmith understood what Hiccup meant when he said that this is not his father. Are you threatening me? Stoic seethed out through gritted teeth. No, I'm warning you, Gobber countered. As a friend, he added before he turned around and left Stoic to think about what he had said. He had to talk to Hiccup fast. Underscore 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 underscore. I bet 10 pieces of gold that Steinar will win, Hiccup said to Iret as his gaze was focused at the center of the Great Hall. He swallowed ale eagerly, sighing contentedly at the comfort that the cold alcohol was giving. Then I say, 10 pieces of gold on Torlof, Iret replied, accepting the bet. They watched as the two men leaped over the round table that was placed in the middle of the Great Hall. The hearth was cleared, and the floor was filled with sand. Fight! Hiccup exclaimed joyfully, much to the approval of the gathered crowd. He bit into a roasted fish and ripped a piece of meat, eating it greedily. After a few seconds of chewing, he pulled out a small fishbone that got stuck in his teeth. Steinar and Torlof began fighting immediately, rushing at each other. The latter one challenged the captain of the guard to a duel. The victor would claim the title of the captain for himself. Steinar accepted the terms, and the two were now engaged in a fist fight. Come on, Steinar! Hiccup cheered him on, observing the duel closely. He was eager to win the 10 pieces of gold from Iret. They fought for around half an hour before Steinar, fueled by the cheering of his chief, managed to throw Torlof out of the arena, roaring victoriously. The audience replied with a roar of their own, complimenting the victor. Steinar helped Torlof to his feet when he leaped out of the arena, and the two patted each other's shoulders, appreciating the good fight. Are you coming? Hiccup asked Iret after standing up. His horn was in his hand, ready to be filled and emptied again. The groom shook his head. I have a marriage duty tonight, he explained apologetically with a small smile. I have to be conscious if I want to fulfill it, he added, receiving a blush from Cammy, who was listening to their conversation. Hiccup's smile quickly faded away from his lips. He never felt more betrayed in his life. I don't believe it, he muttered, more to himself. What happened to Iret? son of Iret, the finest dragon trapper alive and the best drinking buddy, he exclaimed, outraged. You've been married for only a few hours now, and he continued, pointing at Cammy accusingly. The bride was looking at him with a large smile, barely stopping herself from laughing. Already has you under her shoe, he shouted, causing Cammy and Heather to burst out with laughter. Stop it! Hiccup yelled at the bride. You took him away from me, he accused her, turning his gaze back to Iret. So, hoes over bros, is that it? He asked with desperation in his voice. Cammy raised one of her eyebrows at the comment. Hiccup, you have a nice tunic, do you know that? She asked him innocently. It took the young chief a few seconds to realize that the innocence was only a concealed threat. Wouldn't it be a shame if someone, I don't know, poured ale onto it? She asked him, holding her horn menacingly in front of her face. Hiccup gulped nervously, subconsciously protecting his navy blue tunic with the fur coat. Cammy smiled widely at that. Keep your comments to yourself, she warned him, earning herself a heavy sigh from her chief. Fine, I'll go to them alone, he muttered in defeat, walking around the main table. He scanned the crowd with his eyes, attempting to locate Zephyr. He smiled gently when he noticed that she was playing with the other children her age. With his horn in his hand, he walked towards the table where Steinar, Torloff, and a few other men were sitting. Good fight, he complimented the two Vikings, patting them on their backs. I never doubted you for a second there, Steinar, he said, congratulating him for his victory. The captain of the guard grinned widely from ear to ear at his words. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but my horn is empty, Hiccup said, gesturing at the small object in his hand. His men laughed at that, quickly understanding what he meant. And it can be said that I am your guest. So, be good hosts and pour me some ale, he commanded, stretching his hand. Thank you, Vitserk, he said with a smile when one of the men fulfilled his order. What are the plans for the spring? Vitserk asked eagerly, wanting to know the answer. His companions expressed their approval and were looking at their chief expectantly. Hiccup sipped some ale before answering. Truth be told, I didn't think about it yet, he replied, stroking his beard. Now that Dager and his berserkers are defeated, we can enjoy a moment of peace, he offered. But if you yearn for action, I've heard that our brothers in Kattegat are organizing a raid once the winter is over, Hiccup added before his people could protest against his suggestion of a boring spring. They will sail east, across the Baltic Sea, and raid the lands there. When I met one of their warriors some time ago, Haraldson is his name, he said we could join them if we wanted. Would you sail as well? Torloff asked him as other men were discussing the proposition amongst themselves. Hiccup shook his head. I'd like to get some rest from fighting, he explained. At least for now. I thought about going back to Europe, to Constantinople, he clarified. I've heard tales about a land, far, far to the east, called China. It is said that the Silk Road leads there. People in Constantinople claim that that land is beautiful and rich, and the materials from there are something none of us has ever seen. I consider going there, though I doubt my plans will come to fruition. There is still much to be done here. So, maybe in a few years. And if we went with the Vikings from Kattegat, Vitserk began. Would we go with our dragons? Absolutely not, Hiccup replied immediately, wiping away a few droplets of ale that got lost in his mustache. We did not befriend them so that we can spread terror with their help, he reminded them. But, let's not get distracted with the dreams of spring, for these the winds of winter that are blowing now. And we should pray to the gods that they do not sweep us off. Let's drink to that, Torloff suggested, raising his mug. Skal, he exclaimed. The others that were at the table echoed his last word, drinking from their cups. I have an idea, he began when they've drunk their ale. You should do that trick you've learned in the south, he explained, looking at Hiccup. I want to live, the young chief replied, shaking his head. I'm not going to do that. Oh, come on. Steinar countered, agreeing with his friend's proposition. Don't make us beg. You can do that with your eyes closed. Yeah, if I wanted to kill myself, Hiccup said, shaking his head. You've already performed it countless times, Vitserk countered. It's Iret's wedding, he reminded him. All right, Hiccup agreed reluctantly, attempting to calm them down with a simple gesture of his hands. Bring me the torch, he ordered, refilling his horn, The men gathered at the table exclaimed approvingly. He stood up, accepting the torch that was handed over to him. He watched the dancing flames for a few seconds before he brought his horn to his mouth. Hiccup took a large gulp of the alcohol, standing at the bench he used to be sitting at a few seconds earlier. Taking in a deep breath through his nose, the young chief spat at the burning torch, holding it above his head. As the result, the fire exploded, increasing its size. The flames became larger, traveling almost a meter high into the air. His actions caused almost everyone in the Great Hall to go silent as they watched the chief of Driki. "Now, who is the Dragon Master?" Hiccup exclaimed, looking at the inhabitants of his village. The Great Hall erupted with laughter. Hiccup chuckled as well, sitting back at the bench. They continued talking and drinking, discussing not important matters until the people responsible for the music gave a signal that another song was about to start. Many Vikings began gathering around the round table in the middle of the Great Hall. With so many bog burglars present at the wedding, it was easy for many to find themselves a dancing partner. Hiccup was about to retreat to the main table when a flash of gold hair attracted his attention. Astrid was standing next to one of the many pillars that supported the Great Hall, observing the crowd with the other Burkians their age. Hiccup watched with a small smile as she turned down Snotlout's offer to dance and emptied his horn. He stifled a burp with his hand and stood up before the courage that ale was giving him managed to abandon him. He walked hesitantly towards the group of Burkians, getting more and more nervous with each step he took. Hiccup saw as Roughnut dragged fish legs away from the pillar and joined the other Vikings that were about to dance. He stifled a chuckle when Astrid almost jumped, taken by surprise by his sudden presence next to her. Taking advice from Heather's words, Hiccup offered his hand to Astrid, watching as her eyes widened in shock. "May I?" he asked her, doing his best to sound as politely as he could. He smiled softly when he noticed a blush making its way onto her face. His smile widened when Astrid reached out with her hand, allowing him to lead her away from the pillar. He didn't fail to notice Snotlout's outraged expression and Toughnut's shock. He shot them both a victorious smirk. They were looking each other straight in the eyes as they prepared themselves for the dance, surrounded by other couples. Betida en Morgan inan solen upran inan foglana borjates junga, one of the women began singing, accompanied by various instruments. Astrid's blush deepened as they started dancing while Hiccup chuckled nervously, quickly recognizing the song. Slowly, they started moving in circles, with their right forearms touching each other. After a few steps, they changed hands and began dancing in the opposite direction. Burger trollit fried till fagger ungesven hun heidi en folskeliger tunga, the woman continued the song. "I never took you for a dancer," Astrid commented quietly, though her words managed to reach Hiccup's ears. He smiled nervously at her. "I've learned a few moves after leaving the archipelago," Hiccup admitted hesitantly. "Sometimes it's handy," he added, raising his hand to allow Astrid to twirl beneath it while he held her fingers. He marveled at how soft they actually were, contrasting pleasantly with the strength of her punches. His shoulder and abdomen were still covered with bruises that she left there. He couldn't help but smile gently when Astrid's braid hit him softly on his face as the result of her movements. "You're drunk," she scolded him after smelling his breath. Hiccup chuckled nervously at her words and shook his head slightly, looking at his feet. "That's why I had the courage to ask you to dance," he explained himself, causing Astrid to raise one of her eyebrows at that. "And what about you? I don't remember ever seeing you dancing during the Snoggle Talk back on Berk," he said after a short moment of awkward silence as they continued moving to the rhythm of the music. "That's because no one would ask me to dance back then," she replied, making a single rotation around Hiccup. "But it doesn't mean that I don't know how to do that." "Snotlout just did," he reminded her. "And he is your betrothed." "I thought I've told you not to remind me about that," she scolded Hiccup, scowling at him. The young chief smiled apologetically at her. "I'm sorry," he replied. "Though I must admit that making him angry was quite entertaining," he added. Astrid smiled slightly with a small blush on her cheeks. She glanced at the place where she used to stand just a few minutes earlier. Her betrothed was glaring at them hatefully, his face was red with anger. Astrid smirked at the sight. Hermanlig trollof van imig fordet jag juda sajana," the woman recited the chorus again. Hiccup rotated Astrid in his arms, encircling her form with his arms while their hands were still entwined. Her back was pressed against his front. Even through the layers of clothes that were separating them, he could feel the heat of their body against his own. Although he wasn't cold, he had to admit that it was a pleasurable sensation. Hiccup knelt in front of her, keeping his right hand above his head and allowing Astrid to rotate around him. He straightened himself back up and placed his arm around the shield maiden's back, his other hand was entwined with hers, and they started twirling to the music. Their eyes were locked with each other, and the gentle voice of hope that appeared in Hiccup's mind a few days earlier returned with full strength. "What?" Astrid asked him when she noticed his dreamy expression. She felt a strange sensation in her stomach, unsure if she liked it or not. "You're beautiful," he whispered. Astrid blushed at his words, taken aback by the sudden compliment. She assumed that Hiccup was also shocked by what he had said because his cheeks turned red as well. "Thank you," she whispered back, unsure what else she could say. She wasn't used to receiving compliments. Of course, Snotlout would do that all the time, but his words were always filled with innuendo. What Hiccup had said, however, was nothing but a genuine comment and had no hidden meaning. He couldn't quite believe what was happening. It was like a dream, though he was sure that it was a reality. And yet still, he couldn't fully comprehend it. Hiccup thought about a moment like that for a long time in his youth, and now, a decade later, his wish was fulfilled. He had to admit he was surprised that he didn't notice reluctance on Astrid's face, in her movements, or in her voice. He hoped she was enjoying their dance as much as he was. Even though it seemed like ages since the song began, Hiccup was disappointed when it ended too soon to his liking. Reluctantly, Hiccup removed his arms from around Astrid's waist, looking at her face one last time. He resisted the urge to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear when he noticed that it came loose from the braid. He wasn't allowed to do that. "Thank you for the dance," he said, bowing his head. Fighting off the blush, Astrid made a curtsy, and the two went their separate ways. Hiccup returned to the main table with his head full of a range of emotions, all pleasant. He was grinning from ear to ear, looking at his feet as he returned to his chair at Irette's side. His friends were looking at him with wide eyes as if they were seeing him for the first time. Dear Odin, Heather spoke when Hiccup returned. "Can it be that we finally get ourselves a chiefess?" she asked teasingly. The young chief glared at her. "It was only a dance," Hiccup replied, attempting to justify himself. Cammy snorted at that. "You never danced during the Snoggletalk, Hiccup," she reminded him. "And I saw how she was looking at you. I don't think she hates you as you claim," Cammy added with a smirk. "I used to dance with Sigrid," Hiccup countered. He pulled out his pipe and filled it with dried leaves, igniting them with a flint. He ignored her comment, though he had to admit, unwillingly, that it was nice to know that. "But you never danced since her death," Irette countered, smiling at Hiccup knowingly. The young chief huffed at that, rolling his eyes. He inhaled the smoke from his pipe and let it out slowly. "I asked her to dance only out of courtesy," Hiccup replied, attempting to justify himself once again. His friends laughed at his words. "You're not the one to do anything out of courtesy," Cammy countered, sipping the ale from her horn. "Well then, I'm going to talk to our future chiefess," Heather teased, standing up from her chair. Hiccup only shot her a hateful gaze, earning himself a burst of laughter from the dark-haired woman. "I might as well practice being nice towards her," she added, winking at him. Underscore 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 underscore. Astrid didn't know what to think about the recent development of events. She didn't expect Hiccup to ask her to dance, and her response took her by surprise as well. Although, she had to admit, shocking herself, that she didn't regret agreeing to his proposition. It was the first time in her life when she took pleasure from an interaction with a person who wasn't a part of her family. She shook her head, attempting to distract herself from those thoughts. Before anything else, she was the Shield Maiden, and her main goal in all of her actions was to ensure Berk's safety. That's when Ruffnut's words echoed in her mind, reminding Astrid that there was a way to make Hiccup help them. And if him asking her to dance was any indication, the young Horfison deducted that he would be willing to listen to her if she followed Ruffnut's advice. She was standing next to the same pillar as before after listening to Snotlout's complaint at how she dared to dance with another man. Her betrothed earned himself a punch at his stomach, followed by Astrid saying that she wasn't his property and he was in no position to boss her around. With a furious expression, Snotlout left her and returned to the table where they sat at the beginning of the feast. As the result, Astrid was standing alone next to the pillar. She gasped slightly when a dark-haired woman joined her. "I believe we haven't been introduced properly," she began, smiling softly at her. "My name is Heather," she introduced herself. Astrid the young shield maiden replied coldly, not finding the company of the other woman enjoyable. After all, she was the one overseeing the guards that were keeping them in prison. "You danced with Hiccup," Heather stated, still smiling softly. Astrid fought off a blush that started making its way onto her cheeks. "Because he asked me to," Astrid replied immediately. "It was nothing but a courtesy," she added, unknowingly echoing Hiccup's words. Heather chuckled softly at her words. "Hiccup is not that kind of person who would do something simply out of courtesy," she countered, repeating Cammie's words. "I think he likes you," Heather added, trying to sound as politely as she could. Astrid rolled her eyes at that, attempting to ignore the same strange sensation that erupted in her stomach when she danced with the young chief. "Even if he does, he is a widower," Astrid replied, earning herself a shocked look from Heather. "A widower," she repeated, wanting to be sure if she heard her correctly. Astrid nodded her head hesitantly, surprised that the brunette didn't know that. "One has to be married first in order to become a widower." "And Hiccup's never been married," Heather said. Astrid's eyes widened at that. "But Gobber said." "But he has a child," the blonde countered, refusing to believe that Hiccup would do something like that. Of course, she didn't know him well, but from their brief encounters and conversations, she assumed that he wouldn't shame a woman in such a way. "And do they appear only in marriage?" Heather replied, taking a sip from her horn. Her lips were curled up in a smile. "But enough about that," she added after swallowing the ale. "It's not polite to talk about matters like that behind his back." Before Astrid could say anything else, Hiccup's loud exclamation was heard in the great hall. The two women looked at the arena in the middle of the room. One of the bog burglars started fighting with a man from Dreeki. "What is that all about?" Astrid asked, observing the duel. She was surprised previously when Steinar and Torloff started fighting, seemingly out of nowhere. "It's our little tradition of a sort," Heather replied with a smirk as she observed the fight as well. "It was actually created by Hiccup and Irette during one Snoggletalk. They got really drunk back then, and they started arguing who would be a better chief. And so, Irette challenged him to a fight." "Did he win?" Astrid queried, her eyes were still focused on the arena. "Hiccup is still the chief," Heather answered. "Anyway, they turned it into a tradition, fighting during each Snoggletalk over the same thing. Irette never got close to winning, even though he's a great fighter. But they won't be fighting today since it's his wedding. Also, it's a great way of solving various quarrels without unnecessary bloodshed." "What are the rules?" she asked, attempting to sound curious. A plan began shaping in her mind. The solution she so desperately sought when she thought about how to make Hiccup help them has appeared in her head. "No weapons, no armor," Heather informed her, not noticing the hidden meaning behind Astrid's words. "Only fists and legs. The participants also remove their shirts and boots to avoid cheating in any way. The fight is over when one person yields or is thrown outside of the arena." Astrid's plan has already fully developed in her mind as she continued watching the fight. They didn't talk anymore, only observing the duel. At some point, Heather left her and returned to the main table, allowing Astrid to think freely about what she was going to do. It was risky, but her combat skills were giving her some sort of reassurance. To top it off, she knew that Hiccup was already drunk, that would make his moves sloppy. Astrid praised herself for not drinking much that day. When the fight was over, and the two participants left the arena, gathering their clothes, Astrid pushed herself away from the pillar. She felt her heart racing, and her breathing was shallow as nervousness made its way into her mind. She tried to get rid of it. She needed to be focused on the thing she was going to do if she was to succeed. With a shaky breath, she opened her mouth and exclaimed loudly, bringing her plan to life. Underscore 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 underscore. As soon as Hiccup announced the fight, he felt a large hand on his shoulder. He looked up, smiling as he saw Gobber standing next to him. He raised his horn, wanting to drink with his former mentor, but his serious expression stopped him from doing that. "What is it?" he asked him. "Come with me," Gobber replied, pulling him off of his chair. Surprised by his strange behavior, Hiccup followed him, struggling to remain at his feet as the alcohol he drank made it a difficult task. "You have to talk to Stoic right now," Gobber told him as he led the chief away from the main table towards a darkened corner of the great hall. Yeah, I know," Hiccup replied nonchalantly, shaking his head as he sipped from his horn. "I've already planned to talk to him today. I'm just waiting for a proper moment." "There might not be one if you keep waiting," Gobber warned, looking the young man apologetically straight in the eyes. "He wants you dead." "You've already told me that," Hiccup countered, burping loudly. "That's nothing new." "Now it's more serious," Gobber clarified. "I've told him that I wouldn't do what he ordered, and he decided that he'll do it himself," he explained, earning himself a questioning look from Hiccup. "He wants to kill you today." Hiccup's face paled visibly despite the heat that overwhelmed the great hall. He stumbled slightly, even though he was standing in one spot as Gobber's words made their way into his mind. Even in his drunken state, he understood what the old blacksmith meant. He looked at his friend, quickly noticing the desperate look on his face. "Talk to him before he does anything stupid," Gobber pleaded with him. "If he wants to kill me," Hiccup began, thinking carefully about his words. "Then I have nothing to talk to him about," he finished coldly. There was no trace of his previous joy in his voice. "Hiccup, please," Gobber attempted to make him see reason, grabbing his shoulder. "Talk to your father." "That man is anything but my father," Hiccup countered angrily, turning around. He walked away from the old blacksmith quickly, returning to the main table. His anger was radiating off of him in waves as Gobber's words nested in his mind. He sat down heavily on his chair, not sparing his former mentor a single glance. Hiccup refilled his horn and drank the ale eagerly. He let out a relieved sigh when he noticed that Zephyr was at the main table as well, talking with Heather. Fear made its way into his mind as he realized that one of the Burkians could attempt to harm his daughter. Hiccup grabbed a chicken leg and started devouring it, thinking about the news he had just heard. His heart was racing in his chest, threatening to make a hole in his body. He leaned back in his chair, resting against the fur covering. He placed his legs at the table. Hiccup scanned the crowd, searching for his father as he was biting off other chunks of meat. It proved to be a difficult task as the ale was making his vision blurry. His nervousness began increasing with each second as Stoic was nowhere to be found. He glanced behind him, afraid that he might show up behind his back. After a few more minutes, Hiccup relaxed a bit when he spotted his father standing at the wall. The large man was glaring at him hatefully across the space that was separating them. Hiccup's nervousness started changing into anger as he continued to observe Stoic. "He wants me dead, he wants me dead," he repeated in his mind a few times, gnawing at the chicken bone in his hand. His eyes widened in fear, shock, and anger when he noticed that Stoic started walking in the direction of the main table, continuing to glare at him. Hiccup gritted his teeth tightly at the sight. His father or not, he wasn't going to allow anyone to harm him or his daughter. His thoughts were interrupted, though, when Astrid's voice overwhelmed all other sounds in the great hall. Underscore 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 underscore. Stoic was observing Riddery with hatred in his eyes, knowing well what he had to do. He thought about his decision for a long time, considering all possible outcomes. He was well aware that it would be his doom, and Berk would be left without its chief. But if they stayed here the entire winter, Berk would perish in no time due to the dragon raids if it didn't already, that is. So, in fact, he had nothing to lose. And he was not going to allow his humiliation to remain unavenged. The choice was obvious: kill Riddery. Not having a weapon was not going to stop him. He still had his hands, and he knew how to use them. After all, when he was a small kid, he popped a dragon's head clean off of his shoulders. He assumed that it wouldn't be more challenging with that twig of a man. His decision was reinforced by the betrayal he felt, caused by Gobba's defiance to fulfill his command. He felt as if Riddery was turning his own people against him, and he couldn't allow that to happen. Stoic gritted his teeth angrily when he noticed his friend leading the young chief away from the main table. They disappeared for a few moments in the shadows at the far end of the great hall. Riddery returned a few minutes later and sat back down at the table. The anger Stoic felt at Gobba escalated quickly when he saw the young chief staring at him from across the distance. He had no doubts that his friend has warned him about Stoic's plan. There was no turning back or reconsidering. Stoic glanced worryingly at the Night Fury that was sitting behind the main table, knowing well that the Black Dragon wouldn't hesitate to protect its rider, but he didn't care. If Berk was going to die, he would go down with it, taking with him the man who befriended their greatest enemy. His gaze returned to the said man. Riddery's glare was matching the viciousness of his own as the two were locked in a combat of wills, attempting to determine who would be the first one to back down. Not being the one to back away from any kind of a fight, Stoic held his gaze firmly. Ale was reinforcing his courage. Slowly, he began walking towards the main table. His mind was set on what he was about to do, not caring at all about the consequences of his decision. However, before he managed to reach the main table, he froze in place when Astrid's sudden yell stifled all other sounds in the great hall. Stoic's face paled immediately, and he felt as if someone hit him hard across the head. The world started spinning around him when Astrid's words had finally made his way into his alcohol-infused mind. I challenge Hiccup Horrendous Haddock 3. Chapter 21. Her words worked like a spell. In an instant, the entire great hall went silent entirely. No one was talking, no child was crying, and every dragon there didn't let out a single sound. Everyone's eyes were focused on her as she stood bravely next to the pillar with her head held high and a determination written all over her face, everyone's but Hiccup's. He was sitting in his chair at the main table, eating the chicken leg. Astrid could sense the intense gaze of her chief on her, though she paid it no mind. The other Berkians were staring at her with wide eyes as well, not believing what she had said. She knew that her plan was risky. After all, Hiccup could simply ignore her and pretend that he had no idea what she was talking about. But it was a risk she was willing to take for the sake of Berk. Astrid was well aware of Gobba's agreement with the young chief of Driki. The old blacksmith promised not to reveal his true identity, urging Hiccup to do it himself. However, she made no such vow. She promised him, long ago, only that she would keep Toothless' existence a secret. But it was no longer required because everyone has already seen the Night Fury. And if Riddery wasn't willing to reveal his true identity, then she was going to help him, whether he wanted her help or not. And if she wasn't going to hear the end of it from Stoic, she was going to make sure that neither would Hiccup. Even with the alcohol clouding his mind, Hiccup could feel his world falling apart. Astrid's words effectively diverted his attention away from Stoic, and he was staring at a random spot on the table, biting nervously at the chicken leg. From the silence that took over the great hall, he deducted that everyone was as stunned as he was. What is it, Hiccup? He heard Astrid speaking after what seemed like an eternity. Have you forgotten your true name? He bit off another chunk of meat nervously, shaking slightly in his chair. Hiccup knew that he didn't have to listen to Astrid. He could simply ignore her, pretend that she mistook him for someone else, even though he felt her eyes piercing him, penetrating his soul. Her gaze, despite not seeing it, was burning holes in his flesh. But hiding was not an option, and neither was running away again. Hiccup raised the horn to his mouth, swallowing ale eagerly in an attempt to lubricate the suddenly dry throat. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't Hiccup the Useless anymore, he was the chief of Driki, the first Viking ever to ride on a dragon. The first one to encounter the Night Fury and still live. He defeated Dager and his berserkers, saving countless lives of people who were threatened by the possibility of their attack. He wasn't useless anymore, and it was time for the Berkians to realize that he wasn't the same person they used to know. Or perhaps you're afraid that I will embarrass you in front of everyone? Astrid asked another question. That was the final string. In a blink of an eye, all the warm feelings he felt during and after the dance with Astrid evaporated from him instantly. Surprising everyone gathered in the great hall, including himself, Hiccup started chuckling. The quiet sound was slowly getting louder and louder before it turned into full laughter. That was it, there was no turning back. Hiccup cursed Heather in his mind, hating her for being right. He swore he could already hear her saying "I've told you so." Whatever the outcome might have been, he was sure it wasn't going to be a good one. He simply knew that. "No, Astrid," he replied, examining the chicken bone in his hand. "I'm just wondering whether I should humiliate you in front of your friends, your betrothed, your chief, Burke's allies the Bog burglars, and my entire tribe," he trotted out, finally looking at the blonde shield maiden. "After all, losing to someone like me," he added, gesturing at himself. "Would be pretty embarrassing, don't you think?" he asked her. "Get down here, and we'll see who gets humiliated," Haddock Astrid replied, still standing next to the pillar. Her face was red with anger. Hiccup chuckled again. "I'm almost tempted to turn down your offer," he said after a few seconds. "But, seeing how you ask me so nicely," Hiccup added quickly, standing up from his chair. With more grace than could have been anticipated from him after all the ale he drank, he leaped over the main table. "Who am I to refuse a beautiful woman?" he asked, looking around the great hall. His people laughed at his comment, causing Hiccup to chuckle as well. "I accept the challenge," he announced loudly. "Looks like you will see my fighting today after all," he yelled, stretching his arms wide. The gathered Vikings roared in approval, eager to witness the incoming confrontation. "Terms," he demanded. "If I win, you're coming back to Burke with us, and from there, to Helheim's Gate," Astrid informed him, approaching the arena. Hiccup smirked at that. "If you missed me so much, you could have just asked," he replied teasingly, chuckling again. "And what if I win?" he asked after calming down. All humor abandoned his face as he looked at the blonde shield maiden seriously. Astrid took in a deep breath before answering. "We'll leave Dreeki and never return," she announced hesitantly. Hiccup smirked again. "I like those terms," he replied, stepping down from the wooden platform at which the main table was standing. He approached the arena as well, ignoring everyone else except for Astrid. He would deal with the rest of the Burkians, and his father, later. "And if I had known that this day would go like that, I would have ordered you to prepare your boat yesterday," he added cockily. Astrid huffed at that. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," she countered, leaping over the round table into the arena. Hiccup mimicked her movements, joining her in the center of the great hall. Looking each other straight in the eyes, they began removing their clothes, preparing themselves for the fight. Astrid undid the straps that kept her armor and furred hood. She threw them outside of the arena. Having nothing but her shirt covering the top of her body, Astrid felt almost naked. She had never allowed so many people at once to see her without her armor. She followed the Bog burglar's example and refused to remove her shirt as she took off her spiked skirt. Bending forward, the young shield maiden untied the strings of her boots. Soon, they joined the rest of her attire. The sand in the arena was cold beneath her feet, but it provided some sort of comfort. It contrasted pleasantly with the heat of the great hall. Hiccup unbuckled the singular chain that kept his fur coat in place and threw it away, not caring where it landed. He bent forward, removing his boots swiftly. After straightening himself back up, he pulled his navy blue tunic, drenched with sweat and ale that had managed to spill out of his horn, over his head. With shaky fingers, he began untying the knots of his shirt. When he finished, he removed the last piece of clothing, except for his pants. Astrid was surprised to see on Hiccup muscles she didn't even know existed. While still lean, the young chief had certainly filled out more than anyone would expect from him. But his muscles were not what attracted attention. Hiccup's entire torso was covered with a variety of tattoos. Some of them were Nordic runes while others were symbols of a foreign origin. And even though they covered most of his skin, they did a poor job when it came to hiding numerous scars that littered Hiccup's front. Astrid's eyes widened when she noticed an enormous mark, starting at the man's left shoulder, running down all the way to his waist. And even though it has healed already, she had no doubts that that wound was lethal. Or, at least, should have been. There was also a large, circular scar on Hiccup's chest. What surprised Astrid, though, was that it was a dashed line, not a solid one. After a closer inspection, she realized that these were teeth marks. She smirked when she noticed that Hiccup's abdomen, and his left shoulder, were covered with bruises in the exact same spots where Astrid punched him when she was in his house. She watched as he turned around to look at the main table. As he did, Astrid had been rewarded with the sight of his naked back. Once again, her eyes widened in surprise. Similar to his chest, his back was covered with scars as well, and one huge tattoo that differed from the others. The shape on his back was a black silhouette of a dragon in flight, most likely a night fury. The creature's painted wings were reaching the back of his arms, long, pale wales were visible on his skin despite the paint, as well as the same circular scar that covered his front. Hiccup nodded his head at Irette, and the groom stood up hesitantly from his chair. "Fight," he yelled, looking at his friend with worry in his eyes. One corner of Astrid's lips curled up in a smile. The married man had all reasons to worry about Hiccup. The pent-up anger returned to her with full strength when Hiccup turned around to face her once again. She was patient with him, more patient than he deserved. She kept her oath for 10 years, and she was going to make Hiccup pay for not being able to keep his own promise for one night. She wasn't going to hold back, she was going to make him regret abandoning Burke. "What are those bruises, Hiccup?" she remarked, pointing at the yellowish spots on his stomach. They started walking slowly in circles, not leaving their eyes off each other. They were waiting to see who would make the first move. "Did you stumble upon something?" she asked, smirking at him. Hiccup huffed slightly, returning the smirk eagerly. "Well, seeing that they are of your doing, I'd call them love marks," he replied with a chuckle. Astrid blushed slightly when Hiccup had been rewarded with laughter from his villagers. Gritting her teeth tightly, she used the embarrassment to fuel her anger even more. "Then I believe you're going to love this," Astrid said as she dashed at him. Underscore 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 underscore. "I bet 20 pieces of gold on Astrid," Heather said when the fight began, leaning back in her chair. Zephyr was sitting on her lap, observing her father's duel. Irette raised one of his eyebrows after hearing her words. "You seriously bet against your own chief?" he asked her, wanting to make sure if he heard her correctly. Heather nodded her head, taking a sip from her horn. "May I remind you that he beat your ass once," he said. "Exactly my point," Heather countered, looking at the groom. "Astrid seems to be a good fighter, and Hiccup is drunk," she defended herself. "Besides, think of it. If she wins, we go to Helheim's Gate," she added with a smirk. "I think I prefer it to be Hiccup's own decision," Irette countered. "I bet on Astrid as well," Cammy chimed in happily, also leaning backward in her chair, eager to watch the fight. "With all the stories Hiccup had told about that place, I'd like to go to Helheim's Gate." Irette only looked at her questioningly, not believing that his wife was taking Heather's side. "Or Astrid's, to be more precise. Have you already forgotten that now that we are married, we share our wealth?" Irette asked her. "We can bet on other things," Cammy suggested, taking a sip from her horn. "Like what?" "Like who gets to be on top tonight," she replied, winking at him. Irette shook his head, blushing slightly, as Cammy licked her upper lip. "I really didn't need to hear that," Heather commented, plugging Zephyr's ears. "All right, I'll be a loyal friend then and bet on Hiccup," the groom replied, eager to win back the money he lost in a bet against his chief as he directed his attention back towards the arena. Underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup wasn't sure if he should have been cursing himself for drinking so much that day or rather be grateful for doing that. On the one hand, the alcohol was dulling his senses, and Astrid's blows weren't nearly as painful as they would have been if he was sober. But on the other, his movements were sloppier than usual, resulting in him not being able to dodge her attacks as quickly as he wished. He took a few steps backward after receiving a particularly strong punch in the face. He brought his hand to his nose, feeling his blood on his fingers. It took him a second to realize that it was broken as air refused to enter his body when he tried to breathe in through it. Gritting his teeth, he gripped his nose tightly, and with a swift movement of his hand, he reset the fracture. A loud popping sound accompanied his actions. Astrid was smirking at him victoriously from the far corner of the arena, even though the fight has only just begun. It didn't take a genius to understand that she had the advantage, mainly not having drunk over 3 liters of ale. She cracked the bones in her hand as she continued gazing at Hiccup with a predatory look on her face. "Did I really make you that angry when I asked you to dance with me?" Hiccup asked, spitting out blood when some of it entered his mouth. "Are you really such an idiot that you don't know?" Astrid countered as they were moving in circles once again, daring each other to attack. "I've been waiting 10 years, Hiccup, 10 years for an opportunity like that. Because for 10 years, I've kept my promise. For 10 fucking years," she screamed at him. "And you couldn't for one night. And what exactly did I promise you, Astrid?" Hiccup countered, watching carefully her every movement, preparing himself to jump into a defensive stance as soon as she launched at him. He wiped away some of the blood that kept sipping out from his nose. To find a solution, she reminded him, panting heavily. Hiccup guessed that it was because of anger rather than exhaustion. "To do something with the fact that we have found the nest." "And I did," Hiccup replied with small laughter. "I found a perfect solution. Besides, weren't you the one to tell me to figure out which side I was on?" He reminded her of the words she told him during one of the dragon training sessions. "I did just that." "So, that was your solution?" Astrid asked in disbelief. "To side with the dragons instead of your own people." "If I sided with dragons," Hiccup countered, laughing once again, "I would be living in Helheim's Gate, leading the raids." "I've chosen my own side," he informed her. Astrid huffed in disbelief. "So, that's it then? You just ran away?" she asked him, shaking her head. "Like a coward," in fear she added, looking him straight in the eyes. Astrid watched as the blur of his gaze was slowly evaporating, allowing anger to replace it. "Speaking of fear is a little misplaced, don't you think, Horferson?" Hiccup countered through gritted teeth. If she was going to play dirty, so would he. "After all, you were the one to be afraid when I was executing Dager. You were the one to feel fear when I summoned you to my house," he said, observing as Astrid's face was twitching with anger. "But, I shouldn't have been surprised, should have I? After all, fear is almost like a family trait amongst Horfersons, right?" he asked, smiling wickedly when Astrid's face paled as the realization of what Hiccup was implying hit her with full strength. "Who was it again?" the young man queried, pretending to think about something intensively. "It was your uncle," he said after a moment of silence. "The fearless Finn Horferson, a dragon killer, died because he was paralyzed with fear of a flight mare," Hiccup announced loudly, making sure that everyone in the Great Hall heard him. He earned himself a few chuckles from his people and Astrid's enraged scream as she launched at him, resuming their fight. Hiccup smiled inwardly to himself, knowing full well that an angry opponent was more prone to making a mistake. However, he didn't include one thing in his line of thinking. Astrid wasn't nearly as drunk as he was. Hiccup bent forward when her fist connected with his stomach, forcing the air out of his lungs. Her knee was quick to follow Astrid's arm, breaking his nose once again. He groaned heavily as he stepped to a side, barely avoiding another blow. Pushing the pain out of his mind, Hiccup refocused his attention on their duel. Barely avoiding being hit in the ribs once again, Hiccup managed to deliver his own blow, causing Astrid to stumble backward. The strength of the man's punch was big enough to push her away as she struggled to regain her breath. She didn't have the time to do that, though, as Hiccup charged at her. She groaned heavily as her opponent delivered his shoulder into her stomach, once again depriving her of oxygen. Refusing to let his actions go unpunished, Astrid used the fact that Hiccup was bent in front of her and raised her arms high above her head. Hiccup was nearly sent to the ground as Astrid's elbows connected with his spine, right between his shoulder blades. He groaned heavily as he stumbled backward, stretching his back with a loud cracking of his bones. With the corner of his eyes, Hiccup noticed Astrid's leg moving in his direction. He raised his hand and deflected the blow sluggishly, breathing in sharply when his right arm erupted with pain. Her kick was quickly followed by her elbow, directed at Hiccup's face. He turned his head away, attempting to protect his already broken nose from another attack. As the result, Astrid's arm connected with his right eye. Hiccup's head jerked backward as his vision, already blurred, was limited even more. And so, he didn't see Astrid's another attack, he only felt it. The young shield maiden's fist made contact with his face once again, barely a few centimeters below his nose. Hiccup licked his lips, feeling the blood gathering there and sipping into his mouth. He spat to the side. Yield, Hiccup. Astrid ordered, stopping her onslaught for a moment. Unwillingly, the young man had to admit that he was glad she did that. His head was pounding, both because of the alcohol and Astrid's blows. He smirked hesitantly, doing his best to keep standing. I never yield, Astrid, he countered as he wiped his face, doing his best to regain some of his vision. And I won't now, Hiccup added, panting heavily. I've already told you, there is nothing you can do to make me change my mind. So, you're just going to sit there and let us die, she yelled at him. Your own family. Your own people. Astrid kept asking, using the momentary pause in their fight to regain some of her strength. Hiccup only glared at her, once again spitting blood. But you're an expert in that, aren't you, she continued after a moment of hesitation. If Hiccup was willing to humiliate her in front of everyone by bringing up her uncle's death, Astrid wasn't going to hold back from delivering her own blow. After all, you've allowed Zephyr's mother to die as well, she yelled at him, making sure that everyone, absolutely everyone in the Great Hall, heard her. The cheering, mostly directed at Hiccup, died out immediately as Astrid's accusation sank in. The young man's face paled visibly when her words made their way into his mind. Forgetting about his opponent for a split second, Hiccup turned his head around to look at his daughter. Zephyr was still sitting on Heather's lap, right where he left her, and she was staring at him with wide eyes. Hiccup could only watch helplessly as her features were contorting in shock that quickly turned to despair. Her big, green eyes, his eyes, were becoming more and more glassy with each passing second as Astrid's words began making sense in her mind. That's right. He heard Astrid continue speaking. Your mommy is dead, Zephyr, she yelled, addressing Hiccup's daughter. Because your precious daddy was not able to save her. Astrid's words worked like a bucket of cold water on Hiccup. In a blink of an eye, he felt the dizziness of the alcohol abandoning him, causing his head to ache even more. He was trembling with anger more and more as he redirected his attention from Zephyr to his opponent. If he thought he was angry before, he was wrong. Hiccup stared at Astrid with wide eyes, not believing that she said that. But there was no denying that she did. His lips trembled out of rage as he was looking at the woman who dared to break the heart of his little girl. You may not realize it yet, Astrid, Hiccup said slowly, his voice was barely audible, despite the silence of the Great Hall. Each word was coming out from his mouth through gritted teeth. But you're fucked, he warned her. The young shield maiden only smirked at him, knowing full well that she managed to push Hiccup's anger over the edge. But she didn't care. Years of training taught her that an angry enemy was going to make mistakes. And even though she was the one who dictated the fight's tempo, she wanted to increase her advantage even more. Don't be so sure, Astrid replied, smirking wickedly at him. As she anticipated, Hiccup charged at her, though she had to admit that she didn't expect him to be so fast. That failed to give him an edge, though, as Astrid was well prepared for the incoming attack. With a grace perfected during countless hours of training, the young shield maiden sidestepped in the last second possible, causing Hiccup to hit nothing but air. As she expected, her opponent hit the air in the spot where she used to stand. Using his momentum against him, Astrid placed her foot in front of Hiccup's legs, causing him to trip over it. With a soft thud, the young man fell to the ground. Astrid allowed herself to smile victoriously as she looked around, examining the audience's faces. Everyone was looking at the arena in disbelief, seeing their chief on the ground for the first time in their lives. Her smile widened as Astrid redirected her gaze towards the young man in front of her. She kicked Hiccup strongly in the ribs when he tried to stand up, causing him to roll away from her and land on his back. Even from his position, he continued glaring at her hatefully, his face was covered with blood. Before Hiccup could make another attempt to stand up, Astrid stepped on his right hand with full strength, taking pleasure from a loud sound of cracking bones, followed quickly by the man's stifled groan. Yield, Hiccup, she repeated, looking at him victoriously. You have lost, she announced proudly. To her surprise, Hiccup started chuckling, still lying on his back. Well, it would seem like it, he countered, panting heavily. His right eye was closed, still not recovered from the young shield maiden's blow. However, there is this one tiny detail you've missed, Astrid, Hiccup added. Really, she asked, cocking her eyebrow. And what would that be? Lean forward, and I might tell you a secret, Hiccup replied. Blinded by the victory she had in her grasp, Astrid did the most stupid thing she could have done that evening and listened to his words. Her face was merely a few centimeters away from his. I'm left-handed, Hiccup whispered to her. Before Astrid could register what was happening or what his words were supposed to mean, Hiccup headbutted her hard. She stumbled backward as the strength of the blow forced her to step away from him. Without wasting any time, Hiccup leaped back at his feet. His rage was fueling each of his movements, pumping strength into his muscles. Closing the distance between them in a few quick steps, the young man connected his fist with Astrid's abdomen, forcing her to bend forward as she struggled for breath. He repeated her previous action and kicked her in the face with his knee. Surprised by how the tables have turned, his villagers began cheering on him again. Hiccup spun on his heel, directing his foot at Astrid's chest. Still dizzy from his 3 previous attacks, the young woman didn't see that coming. She only felt Hiccup's leg connecting with her torso as she was sent flying to the ground, hitting her head against the wooden table that surrounded the arena. Hiccup walked towards her with anger radiating off of him in waves. Stunned by the sudden onslaught, Astrid noticed him a split second too late. Surprising everyone in the Great Hall, including himself, the young chief did the one thing he never thought he would do. Ignoring the pain in his right hand, he gripped Astrid's braid and yanked her to her feet by her hair. Astrid screamed in pain as she felt the sudden pull. She opened her eyes, small tears appeared just above her lower eyelids. Before she knew what was happening, Hiccup's fist once again made contact with the middle of her chest, forcing her to struggle for breath once more. She felt him removing his hand from her hair as he gripped her shirt tightly with both of his arms. When her dizziness finally wore off, Astrid was facing a pair of green, unforgiving eyes, one of them surrounded by blood where his whites should have been. They were filled with nothing but hatred and determination, the combination she had only seen once when he executed Dagur. At that moment, the young shield maiden started regretting her words as the only thing that was missing was the white and red paint on Hiccup's face. Now, I bet you thought yourself smart, huh? Hiccup said through gritted teeth. But I've told you already, there is nothing you can do to make me change my mind, he yelled at her. And you have lost, he announced as he headbutted her again. Gripping her shirt tightly, Hiccup threw Astrid out of the arena, sealing his victory. Even though their chief was victorious, no one let out a sound as Hiccup was still standing in the middle of the arena, shaking with each breath he took. Slowly, he turned around towards the main table, keeping his right hand on his abdomen that felt as if someone set it on fire. Despite winning, his anger was not satiated. If anything, it was growing with each passing second. He scanned the main table, attempting to locate his daughter. Zephyr was nowhere to be found, and neither was Heather. Hiccup was shaking uncontrollably as he directed his eyes towards Irette. His second-in-command seemed to anticipate it because he returned his gaze immediately. Unlike when Hiccup was executing Dagur, he wasn't looking for any confirmation from his friend. At that moment, he felt no hesitation. His thoughts were traveling at the speed of light, connecting Zephyr's sadness to Astrid and Astrid to the Burkians in the Great Hall. And the Burkians to Stoic, the man who wanted him dead. The night fury on Hiccup's back was twitching violently with each tremble of his upper body, creating an illusion that the tattoo was, in fact, a living creature. Anyone else? Hiccup yelled as he looked around the Great Hall, locating his father immediately. The chief of Berk was standing in the exact same spot where Hiccup had seen him before Astrid challenged him, too shocked to move a single muscle. Stoic perhaps, he suggested angrily. Hiccup spat the blood that has gathered in his mouth at the ground, unsure if it was his or Astrid's. And he couldn't care less about that. What is it, father? Aren't you happy to see me alive? Well, as you can see, I can survive a lot. Hiccup panted heavily, fighting against the exhaustion that threatened to take control over him entirely in no time. Perhaps you've expected me to be dead by now, am I right? He asked rhetorically, not waiting to receive any answer from his father. After all, you've asked Gobber to kill me, he added with a nervous chuckle. And when our laws declared you as dead, I kept you alive. Hiccup yelled angrily. And how did you decide to repay my love? By ordering Gobber to assassinate me at my own house, in front of my daughter. And when he refused to do that, "You've decided to do that yourself," he announced. "What are you waiting for then, father?" "As you can see, I'm barely standing right now," Hiccup said through gritted teeth. "That's right. Stoic decided to kill me today," the young chief shouted, looking around at his men, whose attention was focused on the chief of Berk. "After I've shown them nothing but forgiveness, he decided to stab me in the back. Steinar, Torloff, chain them up, take them away. All of them," Hiccup ordered. The guards didn't have to be told twice as they all rushed at the Berkians that were too stunned to do anything. "I don't care if you will be breaking the ice with your hands or with your heads, you are to leave my island tomorrow. And if you ever return, Stoic, as you have promised me you would, I swear to you, I will be ready," he yelled. What he would be ready for, Hiccup didn't clarify, though. The young chief watched as his father, after shaking off the shock that held him in its grasp, started fighting against the guards that tried to put the shackles on him. Stoic pushed the smaller men on the ground, making his way towards the arena. Towards his son. However, Hiccup anticipated that. The chief of Driki whistled sharply. A split second later, Toothless appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, on the round table, standing between Stoic and Hiccup. The black dragon was looking menacingly at its rider's father, growling loudly, effectively stopping the bulky man from taking another step forward. That gave the guards the opportunity to, finally, seize the chief of Berk. Hiccup Stoic murmured in disbelief, trying to see his son behind the huge form of the unholy offspring of lightning and death itself. "I withdraw my proposition of alliance," Hiccup yelled as the Berkians were forcefully removed from the Great Hall. "And I suggest you row fast. I've heard that the sea is a terrible place to be at, in the middle of winter." Hiccup turned around, ignoring his father's screams. He looked back at the main table as he leaned against the wooden planks surrounding the arena. He had to find Zephyr. Chapter 22. Despite wanting to go and find Zephyr immediately after the Berkians had been removed from the Great Hall, Hiccup agreed, although reluctantly, to stay a bit longer so Ingrid could help him with his injuries. It took some convincing, but, in the end, Irette and Camille managed to make their chief believe that his daughter was safe with Heather. It didn't comfort him much, but it worked, at least to some extent. Ingrid did her best to heal his broken nose and right wrist, though it proved to be a difficult challenge for her as Hiccup refused to sit still for longer than a minute, insisting that he had to go and find Zephyr. It took Irette and 2 other men to make him wait for the Driki's healer to complete her task. When Ingrid has finished patching Hiccup up, too slow in his opinion, he left the Great Hall, urging others to continue the feast without him. Toothless was accompanying him, offering his help if Hiccup's strength abandoned him completely. The young chief accepted his dragon's proposition and leaned against its side, clutching his abdomen with his right arm. It still pained terribly. Following Hiccup's command, Toothless was tracking Zephyr by her scent. The young man wrapped his coat more tightly around himself as the snow was falling from the sky more and more rapidly with each passing minute. He smiled weakly, when he noticed that the Night Fury was leading him to his house. It gave him a small amount of comfort, knowing that his daughter was inside the hut and not anywhere outside with the blizzard almost upon them. Walking up the stairs proved to be a greater challenge than he anticipated, as each step was accompanied by a sharp jolt of pain in his stomach. Still leaning against Toothless for support, Hiccup managed to walk onto the patio in front of his house and opened the door. He was pleasantly surprised by the fire in his hearth. His house was filled with the warmth that contrasted with the temperature outside and the subtle sound of cracking woods. Heather was sitting at the table, sipping the ale from her horn as she waited for Hiccup to return. She acknowledged him immediately when he entered, nodding at him wordlessly. "Where's Zephyr?" Hiccup asked, not bothering with approaching the topic subtly. Heather sighed heavily, rubbing her eyes. "She's in her room," she replied, gesturing at the wooden door behind her back. "She ran in there as soon as we've entered, and I believe she barricaded the entrance," Heather explained with another sigh. Hiccup groaned loudly, massaging his temples with his fingers. His head was aching already. "How did it go?" the young woman asked after a moment of silence. "With Astrid, I mean," she clarified when Hiccup looked at her without understanding. "They'll be leaving tomorrow," he informed her, earning himself a hesitant nod of her head. "Aren't you going to say something?" Hiccup asked after a moment of hesitation. It was Heather's turn to be puzzled. Well, it went wrong, he explained with an awkward chuckle. Everything. Aren't you going to tell me I've told you so? He asked mockingly. Heather rolled her eyes at his question. Do you think I'm in a mood to say something like that right now? She answered with a question of her own. Hiccup shrugged his shoulders. You're not the one to bother yourself with the etiquette, he countered, sitting next to her at one of the free chairs. I love Zephyr almost as much as you do, Heather informed him. She's like a daughter to me, and it pains me to see her suffering as well, she said, looking him straight in the eyes. After a few seconds, Hiccup looked down sheepishly at his hands that rested against the tabletop. I'm sorry, he muttered. It's just. I'm still angry with Astrid, he said hesitantly. His leg was moving up and down nervously under the table. Hiccup ran his hand through his hair, finding out that his braid became undone during the fight. I shouldn't take it out on you. It's okay, Heather replied, nodding her head in understanding. Hiccup huffed loudly before speaking again. I should speak to Zephyr, he stated, reluctant to stand up from his chair. After all, he had no idea how he should talk to her. I believe she doesn't want to see you, Heather informed him sadly. She didn't say a word ever since she ran in there. As if in confirmation to her words, both adults heard a stifled cry that came from behind the wooden door. Hiccup felt as if someone pierced his heart with an ice spear. I have to talk to her, he declared, finally standing up from his chair. His eyes were blurry, and the world was spinning violently around him. Hiccup leaned against the tabletop for support. Do you want me to stay? Heather offered. The young man shook his head, immediately regretting his actions as the pain inside doubled instantly. No, he said when the aching subsided. It's something I have to do alone. Heather nodded her head in agreement and stood up from her chair as well. Wishing Hiccup good luck, she left his hut, disappearing in the blizzard outside. The young man observed the entrance to his house for a few seconds, staring absent-mindedly at the wooden door that was closing slowly. He felt warmth on the palm of his left hand, followed quickly by something wet and rough. He looked down to see Toothless standing next to him, looking at his rider with a comforting gaze. Hiccup smiled at his best friend, patting the black dragon on its snout. He shook his head, attempting to get rid of the saliva. Taking hesitant steps, Hiccup started making his way towards the door that led to Zephyr's room. As he was getting closer, the stifled cry was becoming more and more audible, causing the lump in Hiccup's throat to tighten even more. He wished he didn't have to do it. He tried to delay this day for as long as possible, even though he knew that, sooner or later, he would have to tell her the truth. But she should have heard it from him, not from anyone else. He raised his hand slowly, unsure if he wanted to do that. He shook his head after a few seconds of hesitation. He had to speak to his daughter. Taking in a shaky breath, Hiccup knocked at the door. Zephyr, he asked awkwardly, clearing his throat a few times, surprised at how dry it was. He was met with silence, disturbed only by her sobbing. Zephyr, it's me, he tried again. Go away, she yelled back. Hiccup didn't fail to notice anger in her voice. The pain in his heart returned with a doubled strength. His daughter has never been angry with him. I have to talk to you, Hiccup countered softly, leaning against the wooden door frame. I don't want to talk to you. Zephyr replied angrily. And you can't see me right now. Why? Because, my hair is not braided, she said after a moment of hesitation. Hiccup could swear that she let her hair loose at that specific moment, but he knew better than to argue with her. After all, Zephyr had every right to be mad at him. I've already seen you today without your braid, Hiccup reminded her softly, trying to push the door open. Heather was right, his daughter barricaded the entrance with something. But you said it yourself that you can't do that, Zephyr countered immediately. And in the morning, you did that because I asked you to. Zephyr, please, let me explain myself to you, Hiccup begged her, resting his forehead against the door. I don't want to hear any explanation from you, she yelled back at him. You've been lying to me my whole life. I hate you, she added. If Hiccup thought that Astrid's blows hurt, he was wrong. Nothing could be more painful than Zephyr's declaration. I don't blame you, he replied softly, making sure that his daughter heard him. I would have hated myself as well. But do you know why I've been lying to you? He asked her, not expecting to receive an answer. Because I've been in the exact same situation as you are, he explained when Zephyr didn't reply. I've lost my mother as well, he revealed to her. She was taken away by a dragon when I was very little. And my father didn't try to be subtle about it. He just told me when I was old enough to understand that my mom was dead, he finished after swallowing a lump that appeared in his throat. I cannot describe how I felt back then. I just couldn't bring myself to let you feel the same pain that I felt when I was even younger than you. I simply couldn't. Hiccup defended himself as he slumped down against the wooden door. I'm sorry that I've been lying to you, he apologized, burying his face in his hands. He smiled weakly, when he felt Toothless nudging his side comfortingly. I'd wanted to tell you the truth, I really had. But each time you asked me, it was more difficult than the previous one. I didn't tell you earlier because I didn't know how to do that. I wanted to shield you from that pain because I love you, Zephyr. It turns out I did the exact opposite, Hiccup murmured shamefully. His own tears threatened to run down his cheeks as he listened to his daughter's quiet cries. Hiccup forced his muscles to work as he tried to stand up. That single action was extremely exhausting. He rested himself against the door to catch a breath. After a few seconds, Hiccup hesitantly pushed against the wood, attempting to enter Zephyr's room. He encountered resistance when he pushed the door open. Hiccup heard the sound of wood scraping against wood as he leaned against the door to apply more strength to his push. He groaned heavily when his muscles protested loudly, aching with each second he spent on opening the entrance to Zephyr's room. After a few seconds, Hiccup managed to open the door wide enough for him to walk through it. As he entered the room, the first obstacle he encountered was the Night Fury toy that Zephyr threw at him. He closed his eyes as the soft projectile made contact with his face, hitting his nose delicately. He winced a bit upon the impact. He caught the stuffed dragon with his hands. Toothless squeezed himself through the narrow entrance as well, ready to provide comfort for both members of the broken family. Fighting against the exhaustion and the alcohol, Hiccup slowly opened his eyes, directing his gaze at his daughter, who was sitting at her bed with her knees pressed tightly against her chest. Her face was covered with dried and fresh tears, her eyes were red from crying. In compliance with Zephyr's words, her hair was loose, cascading down in curls. The braid that Hiccup has formed in the morning was long gone. I've told you that you can't see me right now, Zephyr protested when her father entered the room slowly. Her swollen eyes were casting daggers at him, piercing Hiccup's heart and soul. The young man noticed the reappearing tears on the edge of his vision after seeing his daughter in such a state. The knowledge that he was the one responsible for it escalated his own suffering even more. Go away, she yelled angrily, his chest tightened after hearing her words. Zephyr, please, Hiccup begged weakly, approaching her bed hesitantly. She was still glaring at him, hugging her knees as she was rocking back and forth on the furs on her bed. She sobbed loudly as she furiously wiped away some of the tears present on her face. You must understand that I didn't tell you the truth because I love you. Because I didn't want to hurt you, he reasoned with her. You don't lie to someone you love, Zephyr scolded him, glowering at him. I know, he replied sadly, sitting on the edge of her bed. There really wasn't a good solution. I know that I did wrong by lying to you, he admitted. But, as I've said, I couldn't bring myself to tell you the truth. I knew I wouldn't be able to bear seeing you in such a state, and I still barely can. There just wasn't a way of telling you this without hurting you, he murmured softly, looking her in the eyes. Hiccup watched as anger faded away slowly from Zephyr's gaze, allowing sadness to take its place. I'm sorry, he added, not knowing what else he could say at that moment. How did she die? Zephyr whispered, her voice was almost inaudible as her face was buried in her knees. Hiccup swallowed loudly, recalling the events that happened almost 4 years earlier. Sigrid went to visit a nearby island, he said after a moment. It used to be her home before she decided to live with me. She took you with herself and said that the two of you would be fine, Hiccup revealed to his daughter, fighting against the tears that threatened to run down his cheeks. His effort turned out to be in vain, though. You were 3 hours of flight away from Driki, he whispered, sobbing slightly. Sigrid sent Sharpshot to me with the message that that village was attacked by Dager and his berserkers. I jumped on Toothless immediately, and we flew there as quickly as we possibly could. It wasn't enough. When we landed, the village was already destroyed, being slowly consumed by fire. I haven't found anyone alive back then, Hiccup said, not bothering himself to fight against the tears anymore. I found your mother after a long time of searching. She was already dead, he muttered, unable to look Zephyr in the eyes. He heard her sobbing. But the worst part of that day was that I was afraid that I had lost you as well, Hiccup managed to say. His body was shaking violently as he was crying in front of his daughter, revealing to her painful events. You were nowhere to be found, he whispered, covering his mouth. I searched through the entire village, but there was no trace of you. I thought you were dead as well, he told her, afraid of saying those words aloud. Hiccup feared that if he spoke about his fears, they would become reality. He moved hesitantly on the bed, decreasing the distance that separated him and his daughter. By some miracle, I've heard you crying in one of the barns. I have no idea how that building didn't burn down and how you were able to survive. But I've found you there, hidden in the hay, crying. Sigrid hid you there and saved your life by doing so. And even though I've lost your mother, at least I still had you, he said, looking his daughter straight in the eyes. His vision was blurry as the tears didn't allow him to see clearly. Hesitantly, Hiccup lifted his hand and rested it on Zephyr's cheek, wiping away her own tears with his thumb. I still have you, he added softly. Two pairs of forest green eyes were locked in a gaze even if they couldn't see each other well. I have no idea what I would do if I had lost you then as well, he finished with a loud sob. Taking her father by surprise, Zephyr launched at him, trapping him in a tight embrace. Hiccup returned the hug eagerly, encircling his daughter with his arms, bringing her as close to his chest as he possibly could. Hesitantly, he placed one of his hands on her hair, softly stroking her curls. He buried his face in her tiny shoulder, allowing the tears to fall on it. He felt his own shirt getting wetter and wetter with each passing second as Zephyr was crying against his chest. I'm sorry that I've been lying to you, Hiccup apologized, rocking his daughter back and forth. I swear I will never do that again, he promised, placing a small kiss on the top of her head. And I swear to you, Zephyr, he continued, leaning slightly back to look at her face. I won't allow anyone to hurt you again. I swear, he repeated with a stern expression. I love you, sweetheart. You are my everything, Hiccup finished, bringing Zephyr back to his chest, hugging her tightly. He smiled weakly, when he felt her grip becoming stronger. We have each other. And that's what matters. They stayed like that for some time. Hiccup changed his position on her bed and rested his back against the headboard, rocking Zephyr continuously. At some point, he started humming her lullaby. The song was working on him as well, as the exhaustion slowly increased its grip on him, threatening to take over his body in no time. His eyelids became heavy, and keeping them open was becoming more and more difficult with each passing second. Slowly, Hiccup drifted off into blissful nothingness. The last thing he heard were Zephyr's quiet words, muttered into his chest. I love you too, Daddy, she said weakly, barely able to remain awake herself. With his daughter in his arms, Hiccup fell asleep with his lips curled up in a small smile. Underscore 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 underscore. The guards weren't handling them with kid gloves as they directed the Burkians back to the prison. Steinar and his men wasted no time in leading them away from the Great Hall. They weren't even trying to hide their discontent, caused by the fact that they had to leave the feast earlier than they intended. Stoic was the only one who tried to resist them, yelling his son's name all the way to the prison. The guards were eager to reply to each of his screams by pushing him forward or hitting him with the flat sides of their weapons. They have been tossed back into the cell unceremoniously. The guards left the prison's interior and shut the door behind them, refusing to leave even a single torch. Stoic heard the other Burkians talking with each other about the recent discovery, but he wasn't listening to their conversation. He ignored the young adults' exclamations and their questions towards Astrid or Gobber. His mind was focused on one thing and one thing only. Hiccup, his son, was alive. His son was alive this whole time, even though he was believed to be dead for the past 10 years. His son has tamed the Night Fury. His son befriended the dragons and grew up to become a chief. His son was a chief and a father. Hiccup was alive, and Stoic had wanted to kill him. That's when Gobber's words from the feast returned to his mind. His best friend was aware that his son was alive. He knew that Riddery was indeed Hiccup. And Astrid knew that as well. She had known for 10 years that his son didn't die. Slowly, Stoic turned around from the iron bars to look at the young shield maiden and the old blacksmith. She was lying on her furs with Gobber kneeling next to her, trying to attend to her wounds, though his efforts turned out to be in vain. His rough hand was not enough to heal Astrid. It was the first time the Burkians were seeing her in such a state, defeated and broken. She was sobbing quietly, hissing each time Gobber pressed too hard accidentally. But the tears that were running down her face were not caused by the pain. After all, she was a warrior, one of the best to be precise. She could endure any injury on her flesh. But the injury on her pride was something she couldn't stand easily. It wasn't only Hiccup's words about Finn that damaged Astrid's pride, it was what he did at the end of their fight. In front of everyone, the young chief grabbed her hair. He humiliated her publicly by touching that part of her body that was reserved only for her future husband. The damage has been done, and there was no way to undo it. It was yet another shame to add to the Horferson clan. Why have you done this? Gobber asked her softly with tears in his eyes. Astrid looked back at him with a similar broken expression. I had to do something, she murmured hesitantly. Her voice was almost inaudible. For Burke, she added, closing her eyes in shame. You knew, Stoic more stated than asked. It was the first time since they had been removed from the Great Hall that he said something other than his son's name. He approached Astrid hesitantly. The other Burkians stepped aside respectfully. You've known for 10 years that Hiccup wasn't dead, he yelled at her. The young shield maiden winced after hearing her chief's words. Let her be, Stoic, Gobber begged his best friend, attempting to redirect the man's attention away from Astrid. Fortunately for the young shield maiden, his action had the desired effect. Unfortunately for Gobber, though, at that moment, he was the one to become the target of Stoic's anger. And you knew that as well, the chief of Burke yelled at the old blacksmith, reducing the distance between them to almost nothing. You knew that my son was alive, and you didn't tell me, he accused him, barely restraining his anger from taking control over him entirely. I haven't known that until only recently, Gobber defended himself, taking a few hesitant steps backward. I had learned it only when I started working with him in the forge, he explained, looking his friend straight in the eyes. Stoic approached him once again, grabbing the old blacksmith by his tunic. And you haven't told me that, he yelled at him, causing Gobber to wince as well. You dared to keep something like that from me. Hiccup promised me to tell you himself, the old blacksmith replied. He said he wanted to do that today, before I've told him that you decided to kill him. And before Astrid challenged him, he explained. Gobber's words felt like a slap to the face, reminding Stoic that no longer than an hour earlier, he was ready to kill his own son. The chief of Burke stumbled backward, feeling the weight of the blacksmith's statement crushing him down. He turned around and slammed his fists against the iron bars as if he wanted to break them down. I demand to speak to my son, he yelled, punching the bars once again. The Burkians turned their heads towards the door when they've heard a commotion outside. The light was sipping through the narrow cracks in the wood, and an echo of footsteps reached their ears. People were talking outside of the prison, though they couldn't understand a single word. After a few more minutes, the door was opened, and a small group of people entered the cells. Hiccup? Stoic asked hopefully, as he only saw silhouettes of the people who walked in, outlined by the bright flame of the torches they were carrying. Not even close, a cold female voice replied. As the Burkians' eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness, they recognized that person as Heather. She was accompanied by Steinar, Torloff, and a few other guards, as well as the woman Hiccup referred to as Ingrid when the Bob burglars arrived at Dreeke. I demand to speak to my son, Stoic repeated more calmly. Heather huffed as she looked at him with disbelief written all over her face. You are in no position to demand anything, Heather countered as she motioned at Steinar to open the cell. The other guards moved closer to the bars, raising their weapons at the Burkians to keep them in place. And I believe he doesn't want to speak to any of you right now. Thanks to Astrid, he now has a lot of explanation to make to his daughter, she said as Steinar opened the cell. Patch her up, she told Ingrid. The other woman only nodded as she approached the lying shield maiden. Did he send you? Gobber asked as he stepped aside, allowing the Dreeke's healer to take care of Astrid. No, she replied immediately. He doesn't even know I came here. And I bet he will be furious when he finds out I did, Heather said as she observed Ingrid working on Astrid's injured body. Then why are you here? The young shield maiden asked hatefully, glaring at the brunette woman as the other one was attending to her wounds. She breathed in sharply when the healer reset her broken nose. Blood started flowing from there again. Because if he wants you gone as soon as possible, you all have to be in a good condition, Heather informed them casually, leaning against her axe. You have to prepare your boat for the voyage and break the ice. The seashores are already frozen, she added with a wicked grin. He can't do it, Stoic countered, shaking his head in disbelief. He can't send us away now. We won't make it back to Berk through the storms. You should have thought about it when you sailed to us in the first place, Heather replied, looking at the chief. Even though he was much bigger than her, the young woman held his gaze sternly. You should have considered the possibility of the winter catching you in the middle of your journey. Besides, I would say he treated you far too lightly. If I were him, you would already be hanging on the tree at which my brother used to hang 2 weeks ago, she added, looking around at the Berkians. Especially you, Heather said, looking at Astrid. You continue to amaze me, do you know that? She asked rhetorically. Astrid scowled at her. You are the first person I know that managed to make him lose his patience like that, she mused, shaking her head slightly. Not even Dager was able to do that, despite all the suffering he caused him. I've known Hiccup for a long time, and he can endure almost anything you do to him. I'm still unsure if it's his strength or his weakness. But he would never tolerate it if you harmed Zephyr in any way, Heather informed Astrid. I hope you are aware that you could have easily won that fight, right? She asked, adding insult to the injury. The blonde woman winced again, either because of her words or because of Ingrid's ministrations. I've witnessed Hiccup fight many times, and I've never seen him this close to losing. If only you would have restrained yourself from speaking about Sigrid, Heather trailed off, wondering in her mind what would have happened in such a scenario. Why are you saying it? Gobber asked her. Because many of us, including me, want to go to Helheim's Gate, Heather said without hesitation. But we can't do anything since Hiccup explicitly forbade anyone from going there, she explained. Heather turned her head when she heard someone chuckling in the cell. She raised one of her eyebrows when she noticed it was none other than Snotlout. Hiccup forbade it, he echoed her words, shaking his head in disbelief. Do you have any idea how stupid that sounds? He asked her, gripping the iron bars. He looked around at his fellow Berkians, earning himself an approving chuckle from the Thorsten twins. Heather looked at Steinar and nodded her head subtly. The man understood the signal immediately and approached Snotlout. Before Berksek could realize what was happening, the captain of the guard raised his axe and hit Snotlout's fingers with the flat side of his weapon. The younger man yelped in pain as he released his grip on the iron bars. He massaged his aching knuckles, glaring at Steinar hatefully. Yes, Hiccup, your cousin, our chief, forbade it, Heather repeated, slowly approaching Snotlout. She placed her hands on the iron bars, mimicking Snotlout's previous actions. And he ordered you to leave our village, she continued, glaring at the young man maniacally. And never to return, she finished, licking her lower lip. Or what? Snotlout challenged her, approaching the bars from the other side. Having you watch the birth of the Blood Eagle was too subtle for you to understand what would happen if Hiccup considered you a threat. Heather replied with a question of her own. She smiled wickedly when she noticed Snotlout's gaze soften as the realization hit him. And right now, he's incredibly close to doing that, she continued, looking around at the other Berkians. Her smile widened when she saw fear making its way onto their faces. Her gaze stopped at Stoic. Especially with you wanting to kill him, she added, seeing the chief's face contort in guilt. Heather allowed her words to sink in. It didn't take a genius to understand that Snotlout was furious. The blonde twins had an expression that was a mixture of anger and fear, while the fat one wasn't even trying to hide the fact that he was terrified. The one that worked with Hiccup in the forge was sad, even depressed, while Stoic's face was covered with guilt and shame. Astrid was glaring at her hatefully as Ingrid continued to attend to her wounds. How is she? Heather asked the healer when she saw her standing up. Fine, Ingrid concluded. Her nose is broken, but that's the most serious one of her injuries. Her breastbone is bruised, but no more than that. With enough time, She will be just fine, she finished as she left the cell. One of the guards closed the door behind her as soon as she was outside. Good, Heather commented, crossing her arms on her chest. That would be all, she stated as she turned around to leave. Good luck with sailing back. You will need that, she finished, walking out of the prison with Ingrid and the guards. Underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup was standing at the edge of the cliff in the exact same spot where the wedding took place the day before. From that spot, he had a perfect view at the docks where Burkians were working on making their ship operational, as well as breaking the ice. His right hand, covered with a piece of clothing that was moistened with an ointment that was supposed to make the healing process faster, was placed at his daughter's shoulder. Zephyr was leaning against him, hugging his leg while Heather was standing on his left side. Most of the inhabitants of his village were in the Great Hall, participating in the Snoggletog celebrations. Is this wise to let them go so easily? The brunette woman asked him as they observed the Burkians. Steinar and some of his men were at the docks as well, making sure that their unwanted guests wouldn't try anything stupid. You should punish them, not release them. After all, Stoic wanted to kill you, she reminded him. Toothless, who was standing behind them, growled approvingly. The desire to do something is not equal to doing it, Hiccup replied, glaring at the Burkians from the distance. He brought Zephyr even closer to his leg. Besides, I am punishing them, he added. You're releasing them, Heather countered. I hardly consider it to be a punishment. I know my father well enough, Hiccup replied, placing his left hand on his abdomen. It was still aching terribly. Even if they make it back to Berk, he will be forced to witness the village my grandfather left him to protect die slowly, if Astrid's words are any indication. That will be a far worse punishment for him than executing him, he finished, stuttering at the last words. Heather huffed at that, crossing her arms on her chest. They've hurt your daughter, she reminded him. Hiccup closed his eyes, sighing heavily. I've hurt her more, he countered. I should have told her the truth, not lie to her, Hiccup explained as he hugged Zephyr. If you say so, Heather replied, casting a glance at the young girl. If we ever see Berk's crest at our shores again, it is to be considered an attack, Hiccup said after a moment of silence. And they are to be dealt with accordingly, he ordered. As you wish, Heather answered, nodding her head slowly. Hiccup almost stumbled backward when he saw his father looking at him. Even from the distance separating them, he could feel the intensity of his gaze. He felt a small pang of guilt in his chest. After all, he was sentencing his father, and the rest of the Burkians, to almost certain death. The likelihood of them reaching their island was nearly non-existent. The storms were already raging across the sea, making it practically impassable. But his current family was more important than his previous one. He wasn't going to allow anyone to hurt his daughter again. He was ready to protect her from anyone capable of hurting her, even if these were his former tribesmen. Hiccup bent forward and picked Zephyr up, holding her in his arms. He smiled slightly, when he felt her encircling his neck with her tiny arms. The silence was broken by the loud sound of a horn. Hiccup frowned when he heard the signal. Before he could ask himself who would be approaching the island, another sound of the horn was heard. The young chief's frown deepened even more as he directed his gaze at the sky above them. 2 blows meant that the wild dragons were spotted. After a few seconds, another sound of the horn was heard in the village. It was the 3rd signal. Hiccup's eyes widened in shock and fear when the realization hit him. 3 horns were a common signal amongst the villages, and everyone on Dreki knew what it meant, though they have never heard that signal at their island. He placed Zephyr back on the ground. What's going on? The young girl asked, looking between her father and the older woman. Zephyr, I need you to run back into the house, Hiccup said, placing his hand on her shoulder. Hide there, and don't go out until I come for you, okay? I swear I'll see you later. What's happening, Dad? She asked him. Hiccup's fear was escalating her own dread because she had never seen her father so terrified in his life before. Heather, run to the Great Hall, Hiccup ordered, not answering his daughter. The brunette woman had a similar expression on her face, also shocked by the 3 sounds of horns. She nodded her head, accepting the command immediately. Warn the others and order them to protect the village, he added as the young woman started running towards the mountain. What's happening? Zephyr asked again, demanding to receive an answer. Dragon Raid, Hiccup replied hesitantly as he urged his daughter to run back to their house. Dragon Raid, he yelled as loudly as he could, unavailingly attempting to warn his people. Chapter 23. When the third horn was heard, most of the Burkians were standing on the ice, attempting to break it to make it possible for them to sail back to their home. Snotlout, Toughnut, Roughnut, and Fishlegs looked up in terror, almost simultaneously, dropping their tools immediately as they started running back towards the docks. The signal that they knew all too well managed to make them stop working in a blink of an eye. The experience they've earned during years of suffering dragon raids kicked in immediately, sending them into a battle stance. The 4 Burkians managed to reach the docks at the last second possible. As soon as they left the ice, the dragons attacked. Fire fell from the skies like rain, melting the frozen water immediately. Stoic and Gobber helped the 4 young adults to climb up the wooden planks before the dragon's breath could consume them as well. Roughnut helped Astrid to get off their ship. The young shield maiden was still weak after her fight with Hiccup the previous night and was barely able to stand on her own. The Horferson woman accepted the help gladly, joining the female Thorsten at the docks. She gasped loudly when she felt enormous heat at her back. Astrid turned around to look at the ship, only to find out that it was gone. The wooden construction was being swiftly consumed by dragon fire, the old ropes were set aflame immediately. She let out a heavy sigh, realizing how close she was to being killed. The guards that protected them have run away from the docks already, leaving the Burkians alone. Steinar and his men returned to the village almost immediately after hearing the alarm, leaving the 7 Vikings alone. With their ship destroyed, the Burkians followed the guards' example and headed back towards the village, ready to do what they did best: kill the dragons. Underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup watched as Zephyr ran back towards their house, hiding there, right when the dragons attacked his village. He jumped backward when a stream of fire rained down from the sky, melting the snow at his feet. He bumped into Toothless. The Night Fury crooned quietly behind him, attempting to bring its rider back to reality. Hiccup heard the voices of his villagers coming from the Great Hall. Despite the ongoing Snoggletog celebrations, the inhabitants of Dreeki were quick to protect their village. Hiccup bent forward when he felt something flying above his head. He looked upward, noticing Heather at the back of Windshire, soaring through the sky and shouting orders. More and more of his people started mounting their own dragons, joining Heather in the air in her fight against the beasts that attacked them. Toothless growled impatiently next to him, once again attempting to bring him back to reality. Hiccup shook his head a few times, shaking off the initial shock. The time to wonder what exactly was happening would come later once the threat had been dealt with. He couldn't allow himself to be defocused when his village was under attack. Hiccup looked at his best friend and nodded his head, wasting no time in getting on Toothless' back. His abdomen and right hand were aching terribly, forcing the young man to wince as he gripped the reins. He placed his foot at the stirrup and switched the prosthetic tail into the correct position. After hearing the familiar sound, Toothless took off immediately, flying in the direction of the dragons that attacked them. The village was filled with Vikings' angry battle roars. The hostile dragons were replying with the roars of their own, bringing fire at the inhabitants of Dreeki and their homes. The scent of the burning wood could be smelled in the air, forcing its way into the people's nostrils, filling their lungs. The smoke was nearly suffocating. Hiccup flew with Toothless above the heads of his men who weren't thinking twice on returning to their old ways. They might have befriended the dragons, but everyone remembered the times when those beasts raided their former villages. None of his people were willing to allow their new home to suffer the same fate. Toothless fired a single plasma blast at a hideous Ziplyback that dived from the sky, ready to set aflame buildings and humans as well. The strength of the Night Fury's attack sent the dragon flying to the ground, hitting it with a loud thud. Its hide was scorched between its wings in the exact spot where Toothless shot at it. Hiccup noticed with a corner of his eyes that his men were quick to end the life of the beast, swinging their axes and hammers at the lying dragon. He winced slightly at the sight. Hiccup directed Toothless closer to the ground when he spotted a monstrous nightmare charging at Torloff. The young chief was getting closer and closer to the hostile dragon, ready to help one of the guards. He leaned forward in the saddle, switching the prosthetic tail fin into a position that would allow Toothless to fly without him. Hiccup quickly removed his foot from the stirrup as the distance between them and the nightmare decreased rapidly. "Help the others," he ordered Toothless as he leaped off the dragon's back. The Night Fury nodded its head, flying upward when its rider was no longer in the saddle. With the momentum gained from Toothless' speed, Hiccup kicked the nightmare in its neck, successfully redirecting the dragon's attack. The stream of fire that would have burned Torloff alive had been directed elsewhere. Hiccup rolled on the ground a couple of times after the impact. He gladly accepted the guard's hand that offered to help him stand up. The two men exchanged brief nods of their heads before each of them went in their separate ways. It was only then that Hiccup had realized that he had become the target of the nightmare's anger. The purple dragon was glaring hatefully at him, recognizing the young man as the one that attacked him a few seconds earlier. Hiccup's eyes widened in fear as he looked into the beast's narrow slits. He realized too late that he was defenseless. His sabers were in his house, and he didn't take his ceremonial sword with him. At that moment, Hiccup regretted sending Toothless away. The nightmare roared at him, approaching the young man slowly with a murderous glare. The dragon lit its hide, ready to charge at the chief of Dreki in a blink of an eye. Hiccup noticed the cloud of green gas gathering in the beast's muzzle at the back of its throat, ready to be ignited at any second, which would undoubtedly burn the young man alive. Running away would be pointless. There was no way he would be able to avoid the nightmare's attack the moment it decided to fire at him. Putting it all on the line, Hiccup raised his hands slowly, attempting to make the dragon see that he meant no harm. He knew that it was risky, but it was possible that it would work. After all, he managed to convince countless dragons that he wasn't a threat. He smiled weakly, not knowing if he wanted to reassure the nightmare or himself. "It's okay," Hiccup whispered, keeping his hands in front of himself. "I'm not going to hurt you," he added, hoping that the dragon would understand him. The nightmare roared at him again. The gas cloud was slowly getting bigger and bigger. His efforts turned out to be in vain, though, as the dragon roared once again. Time seemed to slow down, almost coming to a halt, as the gas in the nightmare's mouth had been ignited, ready to burn the young man alive. Hiccup's eyes widened even more, if that was even possible, as he felt the slowly approaching death. He wasn't wearing his armor. There was nothing to protect him from the incoming attack. "Hiccup," someone yelled, though the young chief had no idea who that could be as the person remained beyond his view. His eyes were focused only on the dragon in front of him that was going to turn him into a living torch. When the fire was about to leave the nightmare's mouth, the dragon's neck practically exploded. Hiccup gasped loudly when he noticed a spear protruding from the beast's body. He blinked furiously a few times as he felt the dragon's blood on his face. He wiped it with his hand, attempting to get rid of the warm liquid. Hiccup looked to the left side from where the spear came. He noticed Irette running towards him with Camille just behind him. The newlyweds weren't wearing their armors as well. In fact, they barely had any clothes on themselves, only loose tunics and unfitting pants. Apparently, they both were interrupted during their own celebrations. Camille's hair was arranged into the most simple ponytail she could make while in a hurry. The crown's end that used to encircle her head was proudly absent. Her empty forehead was proof that their marriage was legal. "What's happening?" Irette asked him when he was close enough. The former dragon trapper removed his spear from the beast's neck. "We've never had a raid here," he commented, panting heavily. "I know," Hiccup replied, still in shock from his close encounter with death. "Believe me, I'm equally stunned," he added. "So much for peaceful Snoggletop," Camille commented, chuckling dryly, as she threw her axe at an adder that charged at them. The blade of her weapon made contact with the dragon's head, ending its life immediately. The dead beast's body hit the ground hard next to them, sending patches of dirt in every direction. Camille ripped her axe from the Nada's head and wiped the blade against her tunic. Hiccup approached the dead Nada slowly. When it was failing to the ground, he had caught the glimpse of something on its chest, and he had to make sure if he saw correctly. He motioned to Irette to help him turn the corpse around. The dark-haired man complied immediately, and the two turned the Nada's body, laying it on its back. Hiccup gasped loudly when his fears were confirmed. A cobweb of pale marks covered the dragon's chest. The beige scars practically merged with the Nada's light hide, making them almost unnoticeable. Almost. They were there, and there was no denying that. This dragon came from Helheim's Gate. "Help me turn the nightmare around," Hiccup ordered, running up towards the dragon that was close to killing him. Once again, Iret complied wordlessly, fulfilling his chief's command. The young man gasped once again when he spotted the same mark on the nightmare's chest as well. It was then that he realized why that raid was so violent and chaotic. During the raids on Berk, the dragons would burn buildings down as well, but it was never their true purpose. In the village of his father, they always aimed for the sheep and other livestock, always knowing where to find it. They either remembered where the barns were or were attracted to the animals by their scent. On Driki, however, they didn't know where their livestock was, and they couldn't smell it that easily due to the dragons that lived there. That's why they were burning everything and attacking everyone they were searching for their supplies. Hiccup. Iret asked after noticing his friend's terrified expression. "What's going on?" "Hide the sheep." Hiccup yelled as loud as he could, instantly forgetting about the newlyweds. "They came here for our supplies." "Don't let them find the barns," he ordered, attempting to be heard by as many of his people as possible. Even in the turmoil of battle, many of his men heard his command and complied immediately, reluctantly stopping protecting their homes. "Iret!" Hiccup shouted, turning around to face his second-in-command. "Repeat my orders," he commanded. "Tell everyone to protect the livestock and drive the dragons away from the barns." "I'm on it," the man replied, sprinting away in a random direction to pass on Hiccup's order. Cammy was running behind him, doing the exact same thing. "Protect the barns!" Hiccup yelled again, gripping his abdomen. The adrenaline of the battle was slowly abandoning him, causing the pain to return with doubled strength. "Hide the livestock," he shouted, repeating his command. His people and the bog burglars were running in different directions, fulfilling his orders. Some of them were attracting the dragon's attention to themselves in order to lure them away from the barns, while others ran to reinforce the buildings where the Driki's livestock had been hidden. Hiccup walked across the battlefield, shouting orders all the time, passing by the dead bodies. Although it pained him to see the world he thought was possible to live in collapsing, he had to admit that he was glad that these were the dragon corpses that littered the ground and not his people. His heart stopped for a split second when he noticed a man lying on the ground. 3 Nada's spikes were protruding from his abdomen, and the snow below him was slowly turning red because of the blood that was sipping out from his wounds. Pushing the pain in his midsection away from his mind, Hiccup ran towards the lying man. He gasped, loudly, when he recognized him as Steinar. The captain of the guard was still alive, though it was obvious that he would die in a not long time. Hiccup knelt next to him, pressing his hand against the man's abdomen in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. Steinar hissed loudly at his actions. The man turned his head left to look at something that was lying next to him. Following his gaze with his eyes, Hiccup realized that the captain of the guard was looking at his axe that remained just beyond his reach. Understanding his friend's silent request, the young chief leaned forward and grabbed the weapon, placing it in Steinar's hands immediately. The dying man smiled weakly after feeling the familiar weight in his palms. Forcing his muscles to work one last time, he lifted his axe and brought it to his lips, kissing the blade as if it was his beloved one. Hiccup could only watch helplessly as the captain of the guard welcomed the Valkyries that summoned him home. In a few seconds, Steinar would join Odin in Valhalla. It wasn't long before the man's shattered breathing stopped, and his face congealed with a pained smile gracing his lips. Hiccup lifted his head to look around. Many of the houses were burning as the dragons continued searching for their supplies. His dreams about living in a world where the raids didn't exist, were falling apart in front of his eyes. He heard the people around him yelling angrily as they fought off the attackers, though their words were incomprehensible for the young chief. He was responsible for everything that was happening at that moment. It was him who decreed that no one was allowed to go to Helheim's Gate, and now, the dragons from the nest came to Driki, bringing fire and destruction with them. He was the one who refused to help the Berkians with their problem, and now, their troubles became his as well. His village was burning because he thought he was protecting it. Steinar was dead because Hiccup believed that not getting involved in the quarrel between Berk and Helheimsgate would ensure their safety. Dreki had been attacked because he allowed that to happen. Hiccup's eyes widened in terror, and his heart stopped beating for a few seconds when something attracted his gaze. He felt all the blood running down from his face as he saw a red Ziplyback standing at his house, most likely believing that it would find the sheep in there. His muscles refused to work as he watched from the distance how the dragon put its two heads inside. It wasn't long before a good portion of his house exploded, and the rest was set aflame. Zephyr, Hiccup whispered, terrified. He stood up from the ground with shaking knees as he watched his house burning. No, 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 he screamed, his voice was high-pitched. Toothless, he yelled, looking around, searching for his best friend with his eyes. He didn't have to wait long for the response. No more than a few seconds had passed before he heard the unmistakable sound of the Night Fury approaching. Hiccup glanced backward, noticing that his best friend was getting closer and closer to him, flying from behind. He quickly calculated Toothless' trajectory and started running to meet him in the middle. With grace perfected over the past decade, Hiccup managed to catch onto the saddle with the Night Fury slowing down almost unnoticeably. Using his left hand, the young chief pulled himself upward. The black dragon was already flying towards his house, not waiting for its rider to sit down properly. The duo soared through the sky faster than the eye could notice. Neither of them cared about what was happening around them, they ignored both the Vikings and the dragons as they were focused only on Hiccup's burning house with his daughter inside it. The young man noticed with a corner of his eye that the red Ziplyback has already flown away, though he couldn't care less about it at that moment. Only Zephyr mattered. Hiccup leaped off of Toothless gracefully as soon as they reached his house. The entire building was burning, and the roof was missing. He felt the heat of the fire when he ran up the stairs and onto the patio. Using the momentum he had already gathered, Hiccup slammed his shoulder against the door. The wooden entrance, already weakened by the fire, didn't protest and allowed the chief of Dreki to run inside. The interior, just like the exterior, was burning. The wooden constructions were creaking loudly as they were being consumed slowly by the dragon fire. Hiccup coughed violently when the smoke forced its way into his lungs. He lifted his shirt and covered his mouth with it, attempting to lessen the amount of grey gas that entered his body. He squinted because of the bright flames that were almost blinding. Zephyr, he yelled, though his words were barely audible, both due to the loud sound of creaking wood and the shirt that covered his mouth. He looked around frantically, attempting to locate his daughter, but she was nowhere to be found. Her room, he deducted quickly and started running towards the secluded section of his house. The door to Zephyr's room was closed. Once again, Hiccup slammed his left shoulder into it, opening it immediately. Similarly to the rest of his house, Zephyr's room was burning as well. The fire was consuming everything, easily, slowly turning wood into dust. The furs on her bed have already been turned into nothing as the hungry flames devoured them most eagerly. Hiccup looked around frantically, barely able to see anything through the smoke and the fire. Zephyr, he whispered weakly when he noticed the silhouette of his little girl on the bed. His throat was impossibly dry because of the fire. He wasted no time in approaching the wooden frame. Without slowing down, Hiccup picked his daughter up from the bed and pressed her tightly against his chest. The wood around and above them was creaking loudly, threatening to collapse on them in no time. His shirt was slowly sliding off of his mouth, allowing more and more smoke to enter his lungs as he kept breathing. Hiccup turned around and ran out of Zephyr's room as quickly as he could with his daughter in his arms. He leaped to the side when one of the wooden beams fell from the ceiling, almost pinning them both down to the floor. The young father continued running towards the exit of his house. The light of the setting sun was a gentle promise of safety outside of the burning house that was going to collapse at any moment. Before any piece of his house could trap them inside, Hiccup managed to run outside with Zephyr still pressed tightly against his chest. He glanced backward, sighing loudly with relief when he noticed that a large wooden beam collapsed almost immediately after they left his home, blocking the entrance. He pressed his daughter more tightly to his chest, panting heavily. As he breathed in the fresh air eagerly, he coughed violently a few times. That's when he noticed something was wrong. Zephyr's body was unusually warm. He hadn't realized that earlier due to the fire in his house, and he had only noticed it at that moment. Also, his daughter wasn't moving. At first, Hiccup thought that she might have fallen unconscious because of the smoke, but that didn't explain why he couldn't feel her heart beating against his chest nor her breath on his neck. With shaking hands, Hiccup pulled Zephyr away from his torso. It was the second time in his life when he felt as if someone ripped his heart out of his chest and stomped on it. The first one was when he found Sigrid's remains. Hiccup gasped loudly, unable to move, unable to think. He could only feel. And despite everything he had gone through in his young life, nothing could have prepared him for what he saw at that moment. The suffering of his flesh, caused by the Romans, was nothing compared to the suffering of his heart. Finding Sigrid's corpse was nothing compared to the sight in front of him. Zephyr, his little girl, his beloved daughter, his only child, was lying motionlessly in his arms. Hiccup sobbed loudly, feeling the stinging tears appearing in his eyes as he looked at his precious kid. Her face, her usually pale face, was black as coal. Her eyelids were slightly parted, revealing her forest green eyes. Her irises that used to spark with life and happiness were devoid of any emotion as she stared blankly into nothingness. Her mouth, from which dozens upon dozens of questions would come out every day, were forever congealed in a silent scream. No sound would come out of it anymore. Hiccup would never hear her sweet voice again. She was never going to tell him that she loved him, and she would never ask to fly on Toothless again. Tears were running down his cheeks freely as he lifted his right hand hesitantly, caressing her cheek with numb fingers. The previously soft skin of her face was also rough as coal. Nothing stopped Hiccup from moving his hands upward. He wasn't afraid of touching the top of her head publicly, for there was no hair to touch. Hiccup traced the remnants of her kransen, Sigrid's kransen, his hand was shaking uncontrollably. The leather band that used to grace her forehead had been molten into the skin of her head. He felt his knees giving up under his own weight as he fell to the ground, sinking into the melted snow. The ground beneath was cold as opposed to Zephyr's lifeless body. His entire torso was shaking uncontrollably as he gazed at his daughter's charred features. He let out a loud sob, swallowing the tears that entered his mouth. And then another one. And another. And another before he started crying loudly. Hiccup pressed Zephyr back to his chest, hugging tightly her small, lifeless body. His tears were falling freely from his eyes, disappearing in his beard or on his daughter's burned corpse. He was rocking back and forth on his knees. From time to time, the young chief was placing soft kisses on top of his little girl's head in a futile attempt to bring her back to life. Zephyr, Hiccup murmured weakly, pressing his daughter tightly against his torso. Gods, no. Please, no, he begged, though he knew that no god would listen to him. And yet, he continued muttering his prayers that were being disrupted only by his crying. He felt Toothless nudging his side comfortingly, but he paid him no mind. The Night Fury crooned mournfully next to him, sniffing Zephyr's lifeless body. In response, Hiccup only pressed his daughter more tightly to himself, if that was even possible, as if he was trying to protect her from anything more that could possibly harm her. However, there was nothing worse that could happen to her. Hiccup heard someone gasp next to him before he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked upward, blinking furiously to get rid of the tears that clouded his vision. He noticed Heather standing above him with blood covering her face. Her eyes were watery as well, as she quickly understood the source of Hiccup's despair. Hesitantly, she lifted her hand and touched Zephyr's scorched head. No. Hiccup protested, attempting to hide his daughter with his arms. He placed one of his hands on the back of her head, pressing it to his shoulder. He was still rocking back and forth, refusing to let Zephyr go. Heather knelt next to the broken family, with Winshire standing right behind them. She encircled Hiccup with her arms, attempting to provide some sort of comfort. The young chief seemed not to notice her actions. As the time was passing, more and more people were gathering around them. The bog burglars and the inhabitants of Dreeki formed a circle around the chief, keeping a respectful distance as the battle was dying down slowly. They could only look at him, a man without his beloved one, a father without his child. None of them knew what to do. No one had the slightest idea how to comfort Hiccup at that moment. At some point, even the Burkians joined the crowd, witnessing their former tribesman hugging his daughter's corpse. One by one, they turned their heads when a loud explosion echoed throughout the village. Hiccup lifted his head as well, attempting to locate the sound's source. He blinked a few times, getting rid of the tears that clouded his vision. The dragons that attacked them have managed to find the bonds and blew them up, taking a large portion of their livestock with them as they flew away from Driki. Hiccup's despair was slowly turning into hatred as he watched the dragons flying away, heading north. All of them were holding an animal that used to belong to them. They were carrying their prey back to the nest, back to Helheim's gate. He saw red as he observed the beast's silhouettes becoming smaller and smaller, disappearing amongst the clouds. He knew where the nest was. He knew how to reach it. And it was time for him to find out how to destroy it. Chapter 24. Hiccup's legs were numb when he walked through the forest, and the freezing cold of the winter had nothing to do with that. His eyes were unfocused, and he wasn't sure if he was even breathing. His brain wasn't registering such things, the only thing he was aware of was the weight of his daughter's body in his arms. Toothless was walking a few steps behind him, keeping a respectful distance. He shared his rider's grief, having grown used to Zephyr's presence over the past 4 years. The Night Fury was crooning sadly from time to time, looking between Hiccup and his daughter, whose body was wrapped in a linen shroud. The young chief kept his hands beneath her knees and her back, carrying her one last time. He had no idea for how long he's been walking. Time ceased to exist as he made his way through the forest, heading deeper and deeper into the island that was his home. At some point, the terrain started going upward. Hiccup seemed not to notice it as he traveled across the snow-covered ground. His friends and his people stayed in the village, cleaning up the mess after the dragon raid. Some of them wanted to follow Hiccup, the young chief only replied by saying that he wished to be alone. Toothless was the only one who accompanied him as he went to bury his only child. The sky was already dark when he found a clearing deep in the forest. Hiccup laughed humorlessly when the irony of the situation hit him with full strength. 2 weeks earlier, he found a similar clearing where he dug the grave for Dager, the man responsible for Sigrid's death, the man who was the source of his people's suffering. And now, he was about to dig out a grave for Zephyr. Tears were freezing on his face, stinging his cheeks, and his beard was covered with small crystals of ice. He sighed heavily, carefully laying Zephyr's corpse on the ground. Hiccup sobbed loudly while he caressed softly his daughter's cheek, even with the linen shroud wrapped tightly around her entire body, as he used to do so many times over the course of the past 4 years. Swallowing a wave of fresh tears that threatened to start falling from his eyes, Hiccup stood up, slowly approaching Toothless. The Night Fury was sitting at the edge of the clearing, watching its rider with a mournful look in its eyes. Hiccup met its gaze with his own blank stare as he picked up the tools he had prepared for himself. With a shovel in his hand, he returned to the center of the clearing. The snow was creaking softly beneath his boots. The snow was falling on Hiccup's hair, but he paid it no mind as he kept digging in the ground. Another blizzard was upon Driki, ready to swallow the terrors of the day with a soft white layer. But nothing would be able to hide the chief's suffering. Nothing could make him forget that he was responsible for what has happened. Each time he buried the shovel in the ground, his mind kept telling him that it was his fault. He refused to help his father and go to Helheim's gate. It was his decision and his decision only. He foolishly believed that they would be safe from the raids, but they weren't. He ordered Zephyr to hide in their house, hoping that she would find shelter in there, but she didn't. As the minutes passed, the hole in the ground was getting bigger and bigger, and so was the hole in Hiccup's heart. It had the shape of his daughter. Once again, he cried loudly, stopping his work for a few seconds. Fresh and old tears were stinging his eyes, clouding his vision. He failed his daughter, and he failed his village by falsely believing that they were safe. And after almost 4 years, long after her death, he failed Sigrid again by not being able to protect their child. Hiccup swallowed heavily a large lump that appeared in his throat. Clumsily, he walked out from the grave he had prepared for Zephyr. His legs refused to work properly, and the ground beneath his feet was slippery. His heart was pounding heavily against his chest as he looked at his daughter's remains, wrapped tightly in the linen shroud. For a split second, he thought about removing the clothing to look at her face one last time. He ditched that idea at the last moment. He wasn't strong enough to once again see Zephyr's charred corpse. Hiccup picked her up carefully, with the same affection that he used to do her entire life. Zephyr's body was no longer warm against his touch, and it would never be again. He kneeled in front of the grave and slowly lowered his daughter's corpse into the hole, careful not to do any more harm to her. "I'm so sorry," he whispered softly, caressing her cheek with hesitant fingers. He didn't know what else he could say as he placed her on the ground. "At least I know that you are with your mother now, in Valhalla," Hiccup added, trying to comfort himself. He straightened himself up and walked to Toothless. The Night Fury was closer to its rider than before, sitting respectfully a few meters away from the grave. Hiccup looked at him with unseeing eyes as he picked up Zephyr's axe that was attached to the saddle. Hiccup turned around, returning to the grave. The small weapon felt unusually heavy in his hands, just as his heart in his chest. "You will need this in Valhalla," the young chief whispered softly, placing the axe on Zephyr's body. "Tell your mother that I'm sorry," he added, sobbing loudly. With shaking hands, Hiccup picked up the shovel and started filling in the grave with the dirt he dug out previously. Each time a patch of dirt landed on Zephyr's corpse, Hiccup felt as if someone was tearing his heart apart, piece by piece. He had no idea how much time had passed when he finished burying his daughter, but the sky was still dark. He was sitting on the snow with Toothless right beside him. The ground beneath him was cold, but he paid it no mind. He kept staring at the brown spot that stood out in the middle of the small clearing. He was rocking back and forth, holding his knees with his arms. After a few more minutes, he picked up his pipe, filling it with dried leaves. He placed the wooden object in front of Toothless' snout without saying a word. The Night Fury immediately understood what its rider asked for and ignited the pipe's content. "I'm so sorry," Hiccup cried out, not bothering himself with holding back the tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said, attempting to justify himself. "Please forgive me," he muttered, barely able to speak through the tears. "I've always had one purpose in my life: to keep you safe. I've made all my choices with that one thing in mind. That's all I ever wanted," he explained, breathing in the smoke from his pipe from time to time. "Sigrid," Hiccup said, raising his head to look at the sky above him. The stars were shining brightly, illuminating the night. "I am sorry that I failed to keep our daughter safe," he apologized, sobbing loudly once again. "I'm sure you're angry with me right now, and believe me, I'm too. But I swear to you," Hiccup added through gritted teeth. His despair was slowly turning into hatred. "I will not allow Zephyr's death to go unavenged. I promise, and all the gods in Asgard are my witnesses, I will leave no stone unturned before Helheim's gate is reduced to ruin," he said, hoping that his beloved one would hear him. "I swear it to you, my love, and to you, Zephyr," Hiccup added. He gasped loudly when the realization hit him with full strength. He had promised other things to his daughter. He had sworn the day before that he wouldn't allow anyone to hurt her again. He promised her that she would get married one day, and now, his promises would be left unfulfilled. He failed to keep them. Hiccup stood up, letting out a loud groan. At Maelti Minmir he started singing Zephyr's lullaby hesitantly. Despite always liking that song, at that moment, it seemed that the words refused to leave his mouth. At Muskildi Kappa, Flioke Fagra Ara, Fera A Brot Me Vikingum, Stander Up I Stafni, Styrodium Neri, Halda Svatil Hafna, Kvaman Okayanon. Kvaman Okayanon. He sang the song he learned from Sigrid, the one his love used to sing when she was putting Zephyr to sleep when she was an infant. And he continued singing for a few more minutes, putting his daughter to sleep one last time. Underscore 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 underscore. It was still dark when Hiccup returned to the remnants of his house. He wasn't going to sleep there, but he knew he had to salvage as much of his belongings as possible. With hesitant steps, Hiccup walked up the stairs that led to his hut. The interior was as he expected it to be. Burned ashes and burned wood covered the floor. Hiccup walked through the charred remnants, attempting to find anything that survived the fire. His search led him to his room. The wooden stairs protested loudly with each step he took, threatening to collapse at any second, but he paid them no mind. His thoughts were focused only on Zephyr, and he didn't care if something happened to him. He had no reason to live anymore. As he expected, his armor and his sabers survived the fire, although the weapon's scabbards have been burned entirely. The chainmail that he crafted out of the Gronkel iron remained untouched as well. Hiccup picked his equipment up and walked downstairs, somewhat satisfied that his most precious belongings remained undamaged. As he walked down the stairs, carrying his equipment, the burned wood gave up under his weight, and Hiccup fell to the floor. He coughed violently when the stirred ashes made their way into his mouth and some of them even into his lungs. His butt was aching because of the impact. The young chief threw most of his stuff to the side as he stood up suddenly. Anger was fueling each and every one of his movements. The only things he kept holding were the two sabers. He yelled loudly as he started swinging his weapons at everything that was within his reach. The burned woods offered no resistance against the razor-sharp blades as Hiccup attacked them furiously, furthering the damage that was already done. The young chief was kicking, cutting, and punching everything that he could reach. He was blowing off steam on the innocent interior of his house as he tried to satisfy his anger and despair, but his effort turned out to be in vain. Nothing could have made him feel better at that moment because nothing was going to bring Zephyr back. Hiccup yelled angrily again, as loud as he could, not caring if he would wake up any of his villagers. His scream transformed into weeping as he fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands. Tears were running down his cheeks, and some of them were sipping through his fingers. He kept crying shamelessly. There was no shame in mourning after one's child. After a few minutes of sobbing on the floor, Hiccup removed his hands from his face. His body was still trembling uncontrollably as he looked down at the wooden planks below his knees. If it hadn't been done already, at that moment, his heart was ripped out from his chest. There, right in front of him, was lying the stuffed Night Fury, Zephyr's favorite toy. Once again during that night, Hiccup wept loudly, picking up the fake dragon. He caressed it with his fingers, recalling the day when he gave it to his daughter. Toothless nudged his side, offering to comfort his rider in any way possible. Hiccup smiled weakly at his best friend, stroking his snout. "I guess it's just you and me now, bud," as it had been years ago, he whispered. His throat was dry and coarse because of his screams. Toothless crooned in confirmation, nudging its snout against Hiccup's head. "We must return to Helheim's Gate," the young chief said after a moment. "We have to find a way to destroy the nest," he added, gritting his teeth. The Night Fury growled quietly, agreeing with its rider. "For Zephyr," Hiccup finished. As if he wanted to express his agreement, Toothless roared loudly. It was a roar unlike any other he had ever let out. Even though everyone on Driki knew the sound of the Night Fury, those who weren't asleep trembled after hearing it. It was a roar that sent shivers down everyone's spine, bringing with itself a promise of revenge and death. Chapter 25. The entire village had gathered in the Great Hall as soon as the sun rose in the east. The bog burglars were with them, as well as the small group from Berk. It was the third day of the Snoggletog celebrations, one that was the end of the holidays. But no one was in a mood to celebrate. The dragon attack from the day before affected everyone in a negative way. The inhabitants of Driki weren't in accordance with what should be done. Some were demanding to search for those attackers and take revenge on them. Others stated that the recent raid was proof that the dragons couldn't be trusted and should be removed from their village, preferably killed. The majority, however, were convinced that they shouldn't do anything and simply repair the damage that was done, and prepare themselves for the winter that was already upon them. But the final decision belonged to the chief. Hiccup was sitting on his chair at the main table, hearing the others' conversations but not listening to them. The young chief wasn't even fully aware of his surroundings. He almost didn't notice Iret standing next to him, arguing with the people gathered in the Great Hall. His mind and eyes were focused only on the stuffed Night Fury he was holding in his hands. Hiccup was examining his daughter's toy carefully, tracing the detailed miniature of the dragon with his fingers. He felt fresh tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. He couldn't look more different than during the wedding. His hair, previously arranged into a braid, was a mess, falling onto his face and clouding his vision. His skin was unnaturally pale, and there were dark rings beneath his eyes, a clear sign that he hadn't slept that night. His cheeks were collapsed, and his eyes were red, both from crying and one as the result of his duel with Astrid 2 days earlier. His entire body was trembling slightly. The discussion was getting more and more heated with each passing minute. Iret was doing his best to calm the people down, but his efforts turned out to be in vain. Anger of some of the villagers was even directed at the Berkians as they demanded to know why they were still on Driki. The argument that their ship had been destroyed in the attack wasn't working. More and more people were shouting, voicing their opinions. Two groups formed in the center of the Great Hall. One was composed of those who wanted to chase the dragons that attacked them and those who thought that living with dragons wasn't possible in the long run. Hvitserk was at the front. The second one, led by Havara, argued fiercely with them, stating that repairing the damage that was done to Driki was much more important than seeking revenge, especially that they didn't know where to find them. It was as clear as day that the argument would transform into a fight in no time. Despite his best efforts, Eret wasn't capable of bringing the situation under control. The shouts were becoming louder and louder with each passing minute as the two groups began approaching each other menacingly. The chief of Driki was still staring blankly at the stuffed Night Fury, seemingly oblivious to the approaching confrontation. Slowly, Hiccup raised his head, looking at his people gathered in front of the main table. Rage filled his eyes, replacing the despair that nestled there as he observed the men and women that were claiming the right to making the decision that was only his to make. "I have something to say," Hiccup yelled suddenly, slamming his hands against the table. He tried to stifle a groan when his right wrist erupted with pain. His bones were still broken as he found out unpleasantly. He stood up hesitantly, pressing his right hand to his abdomen. The stuffed Night Fury was left on the table. If his sudden outburst wasn't enough, his hateful glare has managed to silence everyone else in the Great Hall. The two groups stopped arguing almost instantly, and Eret sat back on his chair, sighing loudly. Slowly, Hiccup walked around the main table, stepping down from the wooden elevation, and approached the two groups. His bloodshot eyes were casting daggers at everyone gathered in the center of the Great Hall, even though he was younger than most of them. "Havara," he spoke calmly, walking up to the man that was attacked by his father over 2 weeks earlier. "You have 2 sons, am I right?" Hiccup asked, still gripping his stomach. Both his abdomen and his right hand were aching terribly. He hissed quietly. "Yes," the scout replied hesitantly, nodding his head in confirmation. The young chief smiled slightly at that. "How are they?" "They are fine," Havara answered after a few seconds of silence, unsure if that was what Hiccup wanted to hear. He still had in memory the image of him holding Zephyr's corpse in front of their burned house. The chief of Driki let out a strange sound, something between a dry chuckle and a snort, as he nodded his head slowly a couple of times. "Good," Hiccup commented after a moment of silence. "I'm glad to hear it," he added. "I really am," he said, turning around, taking a few steps towards the leader of the second group. "I cannot help but wonder, though, what would you be saying right now if you buried one of them yesterday, he asked suddenly, facing Havara once again. "Or both of them," he clarified. "What if you saw your entire family killed?" he demanded to know. The only answer he received was silence as Havara looked down at the floor in shame. "That's what I thought," Hiccup commented, turning around once again. "Hvitserk," he called out, approaching the other man. "Who am I?" he asked. The leader of the first group was surprised, to say the least, by the sudden question. He knitted his brows, wondering how he was supposed to reply. "Who am I?" Hiccup repeated, groaning loudly because of the pain. "My chief," Hvitserk answered hesitantly, watching as the young man's lips curled up in a smile. "Exactly," Hiccup commented. "So why don't you leave the decision-making process to me and remember your place, he suggested. "Now, I did not become chief out of ambition or because I aspired to be one," he said, looking around the Great Hall on everyone gathered there. "But because I had no real choice since you have chosen me to be one," he explained, walking alongside the round table that was standing in the center. "But nonetheless, I am Chief," Hiccup added with a small smirk. "Chief Hiccup, that is my name," he exclaimed with a dry chuckle. His legs carried him to the small group of Burkians that was standing at the far end of hall. "Chief Hiccup," he added, emphasizing his title as he glared at his former tribesman. His gaze lingered on Astrid. "What is it that the chief does, Eret?" he asked his second-in-command without turning around. He hissed quietly, gripping his abdomen as he remembered the young shield maiden's blows. "He rules," Eret replied after a few seconds of hesitation. "Yes. Good. He rules." Hiccup repeated with an awkward chuckle. "And, as a ruler, he continued, leaning towards Astrid. "Have the last say," he almost whispered into her ear, smiling slightly. "Me," he yelled suddenly, causing the young shield maiden to flinch because of the abrupt outburst. Not you. Hiccup stated, turning around and pointing at Havara. Not you, he yelled, pointing his finger at Vitsurk. Not you, he continued, facing Burkians once again. This time, his digit was pointed at Stoic. And not you. Hiccup finished, glaring at Astrid. She held his hateful gaze bravely. After a few seconds of intense staring combat, the young chief turned away, facing his village once again. You are idiots if you think that our dragons should be punished for yesterday's raid, he yelled, glaring at his people. They've helped us to defend our home, he reminded them. It is only thanks to them that the casualties we've suffered are smaller than they could have been, Hiccup explained, chuckling humorlessly at his poor choice of words. And it's not true that we don't know where those dragons came from, he continued. The anger in his voice was slowly disappearing, and his tone was changing steadily into a broken one. Because we do, Hiccup said, pulling out a small wrapped bundle from the pocket of his cloak. With shaking fingers, he unfolded it and raised the item high above his head. It was a piece of dragon hide. These weren't some wild dragons that attacked us yesterday, Hiccup explained. I've seen how the wild ones behave, and this wasn't the case. It was an organized raid, sent from Helheim's Gate, he revealed. The people gathered in the Great Hall started talking with each other, processing the piece of information they've received from the chief. Some were whispering in disbelief, claiming that they were too far away from the nest to be attacked, while others were muttering in excitement, ready to seek revenge. How can you be sure of it? Havara countered, though there was no trace of hostility in his voice. If anything, his tone was defeated. They could have come from anywhere. This is the mark of Helheim's Gate, Hiccup explained, still holding the piece of dragon hide with the pale scars in his hand. All dragons that I know that come from there have similar scars on their bodies. Toothless has it, as well as Windcutter, he said, looking at one of the scouts. And many other dragons in our village have it, Hiccup continued, looking around at the people gathered in the Great Hall. I thought that we were far enough from the nest not to suffer the raids. Turns out I was wrong, he said, looking down on the floor shamefully. Hiccup sighed heavily, wondering about his next words. If these dragons came so far down south only to steal our supplies, it means that the northern tribes have already run out of food or are extremely close to it, he explained, raising his head once again. If that's the case, then it is only a matter of time before we're attacked again. It might be a few weeks, maybe a few months, but these dragons will return and will continue doing so for as long as we have the food they can steal. Hiccup sighed heavily again, closing his eyes. He massaged his temples when the Great Hall erupted with enraged yells once more. I know that I have said many times that I won't risk your lives by attacking Helheim's Gate, he continued, once again silencing everyone in the hall. And I still stand by what I've said. But it is a matter of our own survival, Hiccup said, turning around to face Stoic after a few seconds of hesitation. And avenging my daughter's death, he added in his mind. I will sail back to Berk with you, he whispered, not looking at his father. His eyes were glued to the floor. There was no trace of his previous anger in his voice, only resignation, despair. And from there, to Helheim's Gate, he continued hesitantly. Release them, Hiccup ordered, looking at Torloff, the new captain of the guard, for a split second. And I will go alone, he added sternly, raising his head to look at his villagers once again. The Great Hall was, once again, filled with enraged and confused yells. Hiccup sighed heavily, closing his eyes once more as he rested against the round table. His head was pounding terribly due to the sleepless night and the noise in the hall. Words blended into incomprehensible nonsense as he tried listening to what his people were saying. Hiccup opened his eyes after a few minutes and looked beggingly at Toothless, who was sitting behind his chair at the main table. The Night Fury immediately understood what its rider meant and let out a mighty roar that somehow managed to silence everyone in the Great Hall. I have spoken, Hiccup said when he was sure that everyone would hear his words. I'm not going to lead any of you to certain death since I don't believe it's possible to destroy the nest. But I can't allow yesterday's raid to go unpunished. And if I don't return, which I most likely won't, Iret will be your new chief, he declared, looking down on the floor once again. Before anyone else could say something, Hiccup's second in command stood up slowly from his chair, stunned by his chief's declaration. He looked hesitantly at his wife, who was sitting on his left side. Cammy smiled reassuringly at her husband, quickly understanding the unasked question. Iret took in a deep breath before replying. While it is a great honor for me, he began hesitantly, looking at Hiccup across the space that separated them. I am forced to decline it, Eret said, watching as his chief looked at him with a puzzled expression. And I'm sorry, Hiccup, but I have to disobey your order, he continued. Hiccup's eyes widened in disbelief. And I'm sure many will disobey it as well, Eret added before the young chief could say anything. I understand that some of you might be reluctant to go to Helheim's Gate, he said, looking around at the people gathered in the great hall. With everything our chief has said about that place, I'm not that surprised, he said, directing his gaze at Havara and his group. But honestly, can't you feel your ancestors call in the possibility of going to Helheim's Gate, he asked them, placing his hands on the main table for support. I know that Hiccup thinks it's impossible to take down the nest and what is inside of it, but I don't believe him, Eret continued, looking at the other Vikings in the great hall. How can I believe him, he asked rhetorically, when all he did his entire life was prove everyone wrong. 10 years ago, no one even knew what a Night Fury looked like, he reminded them, feeling Hiccup's intense glare on himself. He ignored that. Everyone believed that it was impossible to survive an encounter with that dragon until Hiccup shot it down in the middle of the night. He was the first one that has done something like that. Before him, no one even thought about riding a dragon. Everyone would have thought that it was impossible until Hiccup, our chief, befriended Toothless and began flying with him. He has done something none of our ancestors have ever dreamed of. Eret said, earning himself a few whispers of agreement. And you've all seen his scars, he continued. I've known bigger men who died of lesser wounds. I still don't know how it's possible that he had survived all of that, but he did. And when Dagur waged war on the other tribes of the archipelago, everyone believed that it was impossible to stop him and his berserkers. No one was able to fight back until Hiccup, our chief, stood against him. And when Dagur attacked us, Hiccup went after him. He brought him back here, and he flew out of here, all the way down to Helheim, on his own bloody wings. Eret exclaimed, earning himself a collective roar of approval from the people and even some of the dragons. And once again, Hiccup had proved everyone wrong. He had shown the people of the archipelago that Dagur wasn't unstoppable. Once again, he had done the impossible. Eret exclaimed, causing many of the villagers to yell Hiccup's name at the top of their lungs. So I ask you once more, how can I believe him when he says that it's impossible to take down the nest? Eret queried, looking at the villagers expectingly. He redefined that word as I haven't done it yet, he added, earning himself a burst of laughter from the people gathered in the great hall. Eret chuckled as well at his own comment before his expression became serious again. I need no further proof that the gods favor Hiccup above anyone else, he continued. And when he enters Valhalla, I'm sure that Odin himself will bow before him, and he will be pouring ale into his horn. And when Hiccup reaches Helheim's Gate, I want to be there, Eret said when the chuckles died down. I want to see him prove himself wrong as well, he explained, once again causing the listeners to laugh. And I want to do the impossible too, Eret continued. I want to make my ancestors proud of me, and earn my place in Valhalla, just like Hiccup has, he said, pointing at the young chief. The said man managed only to stare at his second in command. We're Vikings, he reminded everyone. We're not afraid of death, death is afraid of us. Besides, Hiccup was there for us when Dagur attacked our villages, burned our homes, and slaughtered our families and friends. He gave us the chance to start our lives anew, he saved us. He was there for us when we needed his help, he clarified. The Vikings gathered in the great hall muttered in agreement. We all know what happened yesterday, Eret continued with a sad voice. What kind of people would we be if we weren't for him now when he needs our help, he asked, looking around at the inhabitants of Driki. Even if he weren't our chief, we would still owe him. So I ask you now, who is our chief? Eret yelled as loud as he could. One by one, the villagers replied with Hiccup or Riddery. And to whom do we owe our allegiance, he asked, receiving the same response as before. And to whom do we owe our gratitude? Eret yelled again. This time, there was only one response as the inhabitants of Driki yelled in unison Hiccup's real name. And who shall we follow to war to Helheim's Gate? Hiccup, was the collective reply as the villagers screamed their chief's name. Even those that were against the idea of going after the dragons that attacked them the day before roared in agreement. Satisfied with what he had achieved, Eret leaped over the main table and started making his way towards Hiccup. The young chief had an indescribable expression on his face as he watched his second-in-command approaching him. "I can't do this," Iret Hiccup protested weakly, shaking his head. "I can't lead them to Helheim's Gate," he explained. "I know," Iret replied, placing his hand on his chief's shoulder. "Which is why we shall do it together," he countered. "We're brothers, Hiccup, now and always." "Now and always," the young man agreed. "Whatever life throws at us, we face it together," he continued. "And I swear it to you, your daughter shall be avenged," Iret promised, gripping Hiccup's shoulder. The younger man looked down on the floor, fighting against the tears that threatened to start running down his cheek. "The beast from Helheim's Gate will be killed, and its head will hang on these walls," he continued. Hiccup trembled visibly. Iret moved his hand to the young man's neck and banged their foreheads together. "We're with you," he promised. Hiccup returned the gesture, placing his own hand on Iret's neck as well. He breathed in sharply, not bothering himself with fighting against the tears anymore. There was no shame in mourning after his only child. "Both Driki and Berk are our allies," Bertha stated, standing up from her chair at the main table. Hiccup backed away from Iret, directing his gaze at the chiefess. "And I cannot allow it to be known that when the hooligans went to war, the bog burglars did nothing," she exclaimed, earning herself a collective roar of agreement from her own villagers. "We will fight alongside you," she promised, looking at Hiccup. The young chief has only managed to nod his head. Stoic and the rest of the Berkians could only watch in a mixture of shock and awe as they saw the inhabitants of Driki yelling Hiccup's name as if he was some kind of god. The chief of Berk still couldn't believe in everything that was happening around him, mainly in the fact that his son grew up to be the chief himself, something that Stoic didn't think was possible when Hiccup was still living on Berk. And he couldn't hide the pride he felt when Iret was describing everything that the young man had accomplished in his life. And when his son's eyes turned to them, Stoic met his gaze with his own one. "Now, I believe we have things to discuss," Hiccup stated, looking at his father with an empty expression. Chapter 26. It wasn't long before the crowd started leaving the Great Hall. Iret's speech worked miracles on the gathered Vikings, ending all arguments on what should be done about the recent raid. The decision Hiccup dreaded so much to make has been made for him. The bog burglars and his villagers have made up their minds about going to Helheim's Gate. There was no way of making them change their mind at that point. He felt as if he was in some sort of a trance, which he most likely was, as he made his way back to the main table. His villagers were saying some things to him as they were passing him by, but their words made no sense in his mind. He ignored everyone as he headed towards the place where Zephyr's toy was lying. He picked up the small Night Fury, caressing it with his finger, and turned around. He left the wooden elevation and returned to the middle of the Great Hall. Exhausted by his injuries, the lack of sleep, and his outburst, Hiccup collapsed on a bench at one of the many tables scattered across the Great Hall. He observed as the people were slowly exiting the room and heading out into the village to take care of their business. Iret was shouting something at them, but his words were beyond Hiccup's ability to understand. "Zephyr," he thought, feeling fresh tears gathering in the corners of his eyes as he studied his daughter's favorite toy. Hiccup closed his eyes, letting out a trembling sigh. He didn't even bother to wipe away a tiny tear that ran down his cheek. "Hiccup," Iret whispered to him, placing his hand on the young chief's shoulder. Hiccup jumped in his seat, surprised by the sudden contact. He opened his eyes to look at his second-in-command. He had to blink a few times because the tears were blocking his vision. "I think we can begin," he said after noticing the chief's questioning look. Hiccup looked at him for a few more seconds without understanding what he meant before his words started making sense in his mind. He looked around, seeing that he wasn't the only one sitting at the table. Iret was on his right, with Camille next to her husband. Heather was sitting on Hiccup's left, looking at him with a pained expression. Bertha was there as well as her other daughters and nieces. Stoic was also sitting at the table with the rest of the Berkians. Hiccup looked down at the small Night Fury, unable to meet his father's gaze. Shakily, he nodded his head, agreeing with Iret's words, though he didn't say a word. "It looks like, for the time being, we are allies," Iret stated, looking at Stoic when he was sure that Hiccup wasn't going to say anything. The chief of Berk seemed not to hear his words as he was staring at his son intensively. His emotions were written all over his face, with shock being the dominant one. The person to reply was Snotlout. That's some bullshit, he huffed, crossing his arms on his chest. Why would we even need his help, he asked the people from Berk, gesturing at Hiccup with his hand. We don't need the useless help, he added, glaring at his cousin. You don't even know how to reach the nest, Hiccup whispered slowly, not lifting his eyes. You don't know how to navigate through the mist, and most of all, you have no idea how to kill that monster that resides there, he continued. With each word, his voice was getting louder and louder. Finally, he lifted his head and directed his gaze at his cousin. The next time you sail there will be the last hunt for the nest in Berk's history, he finished. Snotlout huffed again. Yeah, and what difference will it make if you go with us, he asked, shaking his head in disbelief. Our ancestors have been searching for that nest for 300 years, and each time they've returned empty-handed. And suddenly, you are supposed to be the one to lead us there. Why? Snotlout asked with hatred in his voice. He was staring at Hiccup challengingly, observing his reaction. He smirked when he noticed his cousin's face contorting with anger. Because he has already found the nest, Astrid said before Hiccup managed to reply. Her voice was weak, it was barely a whisper. Everyone turned their eyes to look at her, surprised by her sudden interjection. And I've been there with him when he did, she added. Astrid looked almost as miserably as Hiccup. Her face was covered with bruises, and one of her eyes was swollen. There was no trace of her previous courage or confidence, her entire body was shaking, and she refused to look up for longer than a few seconds before directing her gaze back at the table. Hiccup stared at her in disbelief, shocked that she had taken his side in that argument, especially after the recent events between them. I can't care less about Berk's well-being, Snotlout, Hiccup finally spoke, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Everyone's attention was focused back on him. Believe me, if yesterday's raid didn't happen, by now, you would be on the sea, fighting against the winter storms, he said through clenched teeth, gripping his stomach with one arm. He hissed quietly when his muscles contracted during his talk. There is a matter of reaching Berk, Irette said, noticing Hiccup's strengths evaporating. He did it just in time to silence Snotlout before he managed to say something more, enraged by the chief's words. We will fly there, Heather stated simply. Those who didn't live on Driki began voicing their opinions on that matter, their voices were getting louder and louder, signalizing that an argument was about to happen. No, Hiccup countered firmly. Even though his voice wasn't as loud as those of others, he still managed to silence those gathered at the table. First of all, I doubt that our guests would be willing to ride on a dragon's back all the way to Berk, he said, glancing at his father's people for a split second. If the Berkians were the only one, we might have been able to do that, but the bog burglars came here by sea. We don't even have enough dragons for all of them, and I don't think any of us would enjoy having a company on a dragon's back, he added, looking at his friends. They nodded their heads slowly, understanding the reason behind his words. Second, we also have to take a lot of supplies with us, and that would slow us down drastically. I'm certain that many of us wouldn't even reach Berk. Lastly, I flew once through the winter storms when I was returning to the archipelago, he continued, once again looking at his daughter's toy. And it nearly cost me my life. There is no way I'm going to do that again. Then what do you propose? Irette asked. We'll sail to Berk, Hiccup declared. Then we will have to wait for the winter to end, Bertha commented, crossing her arms below her bust. The seashores are already frozen, and the ice is thick. And sailing through the winter storms is dangerous as well, she explained, receiving a few comments of agreement from almost everyone gathered at the table. I don't care, Hiccup countered. We cannot afford to stay here all winter because another raid will happen, and each attack will leave us more vulnerable. It's crucial that we leave as soon as possible. Many of our ships have been destroyed during the attack yesterday, Irette said. Not to mention the docks. Then order our men to begin the construction immediately, Hiccup said, turning his head to look at his second-in-command. And the frozen seashores won't be a problem. We will break the ice when it is time to sail away. Irette nodded his head, accepting the command. You are aware that sailing through winter storms will mean death for many people, aren't you? Gobber asked him, directing Hiccup's attention to himself. He was sitting too close to Stoic to the young chief's liking, but, fortunately for him, he didn't have to look at his father. You've said it yourself, 2 days ago, he added. It will still be a much better choice than flying all the way to Berk, Hiccup countered, refusing to look at Stoic, even though his father was staring at him all the time. He scowled slightly when another wave of pain shook his body. Why? Stoic asked, finally breaking the trance he was in. He was staring at his son until that moment, unable to say a single word. The shock was gone from his face, replaced by sorrow. He looked intensively as Hiccup slowly directed his gaze away from Gobber and turned his eyes to him. Why what? He asked dryly, pretending he didn't see his father's painful expression. Why is it so important to leave before the spring? Stoic clarified. It would give us much greater chances of success if we waited for the winter to end before sailing away, he added, attempting to speak to Hiccup's senses. Because staying here long will result in another raid happening, and I cannot allow for that to happen, Hiccup replied, bravely holding Stoic's gaze. I'm sure that, as a chief, you understand my reasoning. Besides, in case you've forgotten already, I'm the one giving orders here, not you, he added. And my word is final, we will leave Driki as soon as possible. And what next? Stoic asked. How do you propose to destroy the nest? I don't know yet, Hiccup replied, once again hissing quietly. But we have the entire winter to think on that. Now, leave, he ordered, looking at all the people gathered at the table. My wounds pain me, and I have to think about the recent developments, he added, closing his eyes. He rested his hands on the table, hiding his head behind his arms. He was listening as the others talked to themselves while slowly leaving the great hall. Iret patted his right shoulder before emptying the spot that he used to be sitting at. After a few seconds, Hiccup felt Toothless nudging his comfortingly on the back. He smiled weakly into his hands, appreciating the gesture. He didn't know how long he was sitting there before he heard Toothless growling loudly behind his back. He lifted his head and turned around, confused as to what aggravated his best friend so much. Toothless' pupils were narrowed into tiny slits, his eyes were filled with venomous green entirely. Hiccup's own eyes widened at the sight in front of him. He wasn't sure why, though. Fear. Anger. Shock. After a few seconds, he guessed that it was a mixture of all three. He refused to leave, Iret informed him, standing right behind Stoic. His right hand was resting warningly on the hilt of his sword. Hiccup narrowed his eyes and hissed quietly again as another wave of pain shook his body. Did he now? He replied, eyeing Stoic cautiously. His body trembled again, though the pain had nothing to do with that. He knew that this moment was inevitable, but he wanted to delay it for as long as possible, just as he wanted to do that with telling Zephyr the truth, even though Hiccup desired to speak with Stoic honestly, without lies. Some part of him, hidden deep inside of his soul, yearned to see his father proud of him. He had to admit that he hoped, even though it was madness, that maybe, just maybe, when he would reveal himself to his father, Stoic would look at him differently. That perhaps something in his attitude towards him would change if he saw that his son has grown up to be a chief as well. He wanted to see the joy in his father's eyes when he would introduce Zephyr to him properly as his grandchild. But those hopes began to disappear when Gobber told him what Stoic has ordered him to do, and they have evaporated entirely during the wedding feast. He was ready to kill me, Hiccup reminded himself, recalling how Stoic looked at him just before Astrid challenged him to a duel. It needs to be done, he said to himself. Leave us, he ordered, still eyeing Stoic cautiously. His father was looking back at him with the same pained expression as before, seemingly still unable to say a word. For a split second, Hiccup thought that he had seen small tears gathered in the corners of his eyes. He shook his head after a few seconds, certain that the dim light of the great hall was responsible for that. Are you sure? Iret asked him, remembering what Hiccup has said right after his fight with Astrid. Yes, Hiccup replied, still not looking at his second-in-command. He was playing with his daughter's toy to hide his nervousness, he didn't trust his hands not to betray his emotions. Toothless will be with me all the time, he added, though he wasn't sure if he directed those words to Iret, Stoic, or to himself. Hiccup didn't fail to notice that his father turned his eyes to look at the black dragon who was sitting right behind him, still growling menacingly, though it wasn't nearly as loud as in the beginning. Iret nodded his head respectfully and turned around to leave the great hall. He had to repeat Hiccup's orders to the villagers and tell them to start building the ships. Hiccup watched as Iret left the great hall, following his movements with his eyes. When the door closed behind him, he directed his gaze back at his father. He hissed quietly, though he wasn't sure if it was because of the pain. Instinctively, he brought his right hand to his stomach as if he wanted to protect it from more impacts. Stoic was standing a dozen or so meters away from the table at which Hiccup was sitting. His eyes were pacing back and forth between his son and the Night Fury behind his back. His hand traveled instinctively to his belt, only to find that his weapon was still not there. Instead, he dried the palm of his hand against his clothes. Hiccup breathed in sharply as he continued to look at his father. The silence, only disturbed by Toothless' continuous growls, was slowly becoming more and more difficult to handle. He grunted suddenly as another wave of pain erupted from his stomach.